Single Dad offered water to a collapsed runner. The man's warning made him grab his kids and run. He thought he was just helping a stranger on a hot trail. But when that collapsing runner grabbed his arm and whispered a warning no parent should ever hear, this single dad realized he wasn't saving a stranger's life. He was saving his children's. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The July sun hadn't yet cleared the horizon when Daniel Mercer's alarm buzzed at 5:15 a.m. He reached over and silenced it quickly, not wanting to wake the kids in their small duplex where sound carried through the thin walls. The morning air already felt heavy and warm. It was going to be another scorcher. Daniel sat on the edge of his bed for a moment, running his hands through his graying hair. 3 years. Some mornings it felt like yesterday that Sarah had been here, and others it seemed like a lifetime ago. The weight of raising 2 teenagers alone pressed down on his shoulders, as constant as the stack of bills on the kitchen counter. Bud Dwelling wouldn't get breakfast made. Daniel pulled on his worn jeans and a faded t-shirt. Padding quietly to the kitchen, the linoleum floor creaked under his feet, just one more thing he couldn't afford to fix. He started the coffee maker and pulled out eggs and bread, determined to give his kids a proper breakfast before their hike. As he whisked eggs in a bowl, Daniel thought about how distant they'd all grown lately. Lily spent most of her time in her room with her photography, while Jacob buried himself in his video games. The few family dinners they managed to have together were quiet affairs, punctuated mainly by requests to pass the salt. The smell of coffee and cooking eggs gradually drew Jacob from his room. His dark hair stuck up in all directions as he slumped into a kitchen chair, still half asleep. "Dad, why were you up so early on Saturday? Remember? We talked about this last night. We're going hiking." Daniel slid a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of his son. "Eat up, buddy." Jacob poked at his eggs with his fork. "Oh yeah, the whole family bonding thing." Despite his sleepy grumbling, there was a hint of interest in his voice. Lily appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, already dressed in shorts and a t-shirt. Her long brown hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. She looked so much like Sarah sometimes it made Daniel's heart ache. "Morning, sweetheart. Breakfast is ready." "I'm not really hungry," Lily said, but sat down anyway, nibbling at a piece of toast. Her camera hung around her neck. It went everywhere with her these days. "You'll need your energy for the hike," Daniel said, sitting down with his own plate. "Cedar Ridge Trail isn't too tough, but it's going to be hot today." Lily's expression remained neutral, but Daniel caught the slight eye roll. "Dad, are you sure about this?" "I mean, none of us are." "Exactly, outdoor experts. That's kind of the point," Daniel said carefully, spreading jam on his toast. "We'll learn together. I thought it might be nice to have something that's just ours, a family tradition." Because the old traditions weren't good enough? Lily's voice had that edge to it, the one that had become more frequent since Sarah died. Daniel took a deep breath. "No, honey, nothing like that. I think it sounds cool," Jacob interrupted, now more awake and working on his second helping of eggs. "Maybe we'll see some hawks or something. I read online that they nest up in Cedar Ridge." Daniel shot his son a grateful look. "That's right. And the view from the ridge is supposed to be amazing." They finished breakfast in relative quiet, but it felt less tense than usual. Daniel packed water bottles and granola bars while the kids got ready, trying not to worry about whether this was a good idea or not. The therapist had suggested finding new ways to connect as a family, and this seemed better than sitting in front of the TV, pretending they were spending quality time together. By 6:15, they were loading into Daniel's old pickup truck. The air conditioning worked just enough to keep them from melting, and the familiar rattle of the engine was oddly comforting as they drove through the quiet streets of their small town. "Dad?" Jacob leaned forward from the back seat. "Can I use your old binoculars? For the hawks?" "Sure, they're in the glove compartment." Daniel smiled as Jacob eagerly retrieved them, already adjusting the strap to fit around his neck. Lily sat silently in the passenger seat, watching the houses give way to trees as they approached the trailhead. But when Daniel glanced over, he noticed her fingers moving over her camera, checking settings and adjusting the lens. A good sign. She always took pictures when something interested her. The parking lot at Cedar Ridge Forest Trail was empty when they arrived at 6:30. Daniel helped Jacob adjust his backpack straps while Lily got out and stretched, her camera already lifting to capture the morning light filtering through the trees. "Remember to stay hydrated," Daniel said, handing each of them a water bottle. The morning sun was strengthening quickly, promising the hot day the weather report had predicted. We'll take it slow and steady. Jacob bounced on his toes, binoculars swinging from his neck. Can I lead? I downloaded a trail map on my phone. Sure, but stay where we can see you, Daniel agreed, adjusting his own backpack. He watched as Jacob eagerly started toward the trailhead, then fell into step beside Lily. She wasn't exactly smiling, but her expression had softened as she took in their surroundings. The morning sun filtered through the leaves above them, creating patterns on the ground that shifted with the gentle breeze. Despite the early hour, birds were already calling to each other in the canopy overhead. Daniel breathed in deeply, taking in the scent of warm earth and green growing things. Maybe, just maybe, this hadn't been such a bad idea after all. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft click of Lily's camera as she captured the way the light fell across the trail ahead. "The morning light is really good for photos," she said quietly, not quite meeting his eyes but not avoiding them either. "I'm glad you brought your camera," Daniel replied, careful to keep his tone casual. It was the most she'd volunteered about her photography in weeks. Ahead of them, Jacob had stopped to consult his phone, the binoculars now raised to his eyes as he scanned the treetops. "Dad, Lily, I think I see something moving up there." Daniel smiled as Lily quickened her pace to join her brother, her camera already rising. The morning was still young, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of hope for his little family. The morning sun filtered through the dense canopy of maple and oak trees as Daniel led his children along the Cedar Ridge Forest Trail. Even at 7 in the morning, the humidity wrapped around them like a thick blanket, making their t-shirts stick to their backs. The chirping of cardinals and sparrows filled the quiet forest, their songs echoing through the still air. "Watch your step here," Daniel called out, pointing to a gnarly tree root that crossed the dirt path. Jacob hopped over it with teenage enthusiasm, while Lily carefully stepped around it, her eyes fixed on the ground. The trail wound through the woods like a dusty ribbon, occasionally offering glimpses of the creek that ran parallel to their path. The sound of running water provided a constant, soothing backdrop to their hike. Daniel checked over his shoulder every few minutes, making sure both kids were keeping up. "Dad, look at that butterfly." Jacob pointed to a yellow swallowtail that danced through a shaft of sunlight. His face lit up with the simple joy of discovery, reminding Daniel of easier times. When the kids were younger, they had covered about a mile when Jacob suddenly stopped in his tracks. "Dad?" His voice cracked with uncertainty. "There's someone down there." He pointed toward the creek bed below the trail. Daniel squinted through the morning haze. About 20 feet down the embankment, partially hidden by undergrowth, lay what appeared to be a person. The figure wasn't moving. "Both of you stay here," Daniel instructed firmly, his heart beginning to race. "Right here on the trail, understand?" Lily grabbed Jacob's arm, pulling him close to her side. Her face had gone pale, and she nodded silently. Daniel carefully made his way down the steep embankment, using saplings and rocks for support as loose dirt slid beneath his feet. As he got closer, he could see it was a man in running clothes, shorts, and a moisture-wicking shirt, both soaked through with sweat. The man appeared to be in his 50s, his face flushed an alarming shade of red. "Sir?" Daniel called out as he approached. "Can you hear me?" The man didn't respond. Daniel knelt beside him, checking for breathing. It was there, but shallow and rapid. The runner's skin felt hot to the touch, definitely heat exhaustion, maybe even heat stroke. Daniel had seen similar cases during his years working construction. "Lily," he called up to the trail, trying to keep his voice steady. "Bring me your water bottle, honey." He heard the scraping of shoes on dirt as Lily carefully made her way down. She handed him the bottle with trembling hands, then scrambled back up to Jacob. Daniel lifted the man's head gently, propping him against the trunk of a maple tree where the shade was deepest. He dribbled small amounts of water onto the man's cracked lips, watching as some of it trickled into his mouth. "Sir, can you hear me now?" Daniel patted the man's cheek lightly. The runner's eyes suddenly flew open, wild and unfocused. His hand shot out, fingers clamping around Daniel's wrist with surprising strength. Daniel tried to pull back, startled, but the man held firm. "Get your children out of here," the runner rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes darted around frantically, looking at something beyond Daniel. "Run! Now!" Up on the trail, Lily let out a sob. The sound seemed to echo through the trees, breaking the morning quiet. Daniel turned to see tears streaming down her face as she clutched Jacob's shoulder. The grip on Daniel's wrist went slack as the runner slumped back against the tree, unconscious once again. His breathing remained shallow, his skin hot and dry to the touch. Daniel's hands shook slightly as he pulled his phone from his pocket. He glanced at the screen. 2 bars of service. Thank God. He dialed 911, keeping his voice as calm as possible as he explained the situation to the dispatcher. "We're on the Cedar Ridge Forest Trail, about a mile in from the main parking lot," he said, trying to remember the trail markers they'd passed. "Just past marker CR7, near the creek bend. There's an unconscious runner showing signs of heat exhaustion or heat stroke." The dispatcher assured him help was on the way. Daniel ended the call and looked up at his children. Jacob stood frozen, his usual energy completely drained away. Lily had both arms wrapped around her brother now, her face pressed against his shoulder. "It's okay," Daniel called up to them, trying to project confidence he didn't quite feel. "Help is coming. We just need to wait here with him until the paramedics arrive." "What's wrong with him, Dad?" Jacob's voice quivered slightly. "He's probably got heat exhaustion from running in this weather," Daniel explained, keeping his tone matter-of-fact and calm. "The paramedics will know exactly what to do for him." He looked down at the unconscious runner, then back up at his shaken children. "Lily, honey, could you and Jacob find a comfortable spot to sit up there? Maybe in the shade of that big oak? This might take a little while." Lily nodded, guiding her brother to the tree Daniel had pointed out. They sat close together, neither speaking, their eyes fixed on their father and the mysterious runner below. Daniel settled in to wait, keeping 2 fingers pressed against the runner's wrist to monitor his pulse. The morning birds continued their songs overhead, seemingly oblivious to the drama unfolding below. Somewhere in the distance, Daniel thought he could hear the faint wail of approaching sirens. "Help is almost here," he said softly, as much to himself as to his children. The runner didn't respond, his head lolled to one side, chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Daniel checked his watch. Only 7 minutes had passed since his call, but it felt like hours. From their perch by the oak tree, Lily sniffled quietly. "Is he going to be okay, Dad?" "The paramedics will take good care of him," Daniel assured her, wishing he felt as confident as he tried to sound. He kept his eyes on the runner's face, watching for any sign of returning consciousness. While straining his ears for the sound of approaching emergency personnel, the sirens grew louder, their wail bouncing off the trees. Daniel squeezed the runner's shoulder gently. "Hold on," he murmured. "Help is almost here." The distant wail of sirens pierced the morning quiet. Daniel stood at the top of the embankment, waving his arms to guide the emergency responders. Lily and Jacob huddled together on a fallen log, their earlier hiking enthusiasm replaced by worried expressions. 2 EMTs appeared on the trail, their blue uniforms dark with sweat as they carried heavy medical equipment. A 3rd EMT followed close behind with a collapsible stretcher. "Down here," Daniel called out, pointing toward the creek bed where the unconscious runner lay. "I've been giving him small sips of water, but he's been in and out of consciousness." The 1st EMT, a woman with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, carefully made her way down the slope. "I'm Rita," she said, kneeling beside the runner. "How long has he been like this?" "We found him about 15 minutes ago," Daniel replied, stepping back to give them room to work. He came to briefly but seemed confused. The 2nd EMT, a younger man with close-cropped hair, began checking the runner's vital signs while Rita attached monitoring equipment. "Classic heat exhaustion, maybe moving into heat stroke," he reported, wiping sweat from his own forehead. "BP's low, pulse is rapid." Daniel glanced up at his children. Jacob had edged closer to the embankment, curiosity overtaking his fear, while Lily remained rooted to the log, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "Sir?" Rita gently patted the runner's cheek. "Can you hear me?" The man's eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus. His hand reached out, grasping weakly at the air before finding Rita's sleeve. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, his voice hoarse. "Those kids up there, I scared them. Didn't mean to." "It's okay, Daniel," called down, trying to sound reassuring. "We're just glad we found you in time." The runner's head rolled toward Daniel's voice. "Must have been the heat," he said, each word seemingly requiring great effort. "Started seeing things, talking nonsense. Sorry about that, the warning. Just hallucinating." "Your body temperature is pretty high," Rita explained, preparing an IV line. "That can definitely cause confusion. Let's get some fluids in you and cool you down." The 3rd EMT had returned with the stretcher, and together the team carefully lifted the runner onto it. They secured him with straps and began the challenging task of navigating the embankment. Daniel helped guide the stretcher up the steep slope, his shoes sliding in the loose dirt. Jacob had retreated to stand beside his sister, both watching wide-eyed as the EMTs wheeled the stretcher past them. The runner's eyes were closed again, his face less flushed than before, but still unnaturally red. "Will he be okay, Jacob?" asked, his voice small. Rita paused beside them, offering a kind smile. "He should be fine after some treatment at the hospital. You kids did the right thing, getting your dad's attention when you saw him." They followed the EMTs back along the trail, the wheels of the stretcher creating parallel tracks in the dirt. The morning had grown even hotter, and Daniel could feel sweat trickling down his back. He kept his children close, one hand resting protectively on Jacob's shoulder. As they approached the parking area where the ambulance waited, Rita fell into step beside Daniel. Her expression had grown serious. "There's something you should know," she said in a low voice, glancing at Lily and Jacob to make sure they couldn't hear. "During transport, he kept whispering your name." Daniel felt a cold chill despite the heat. "My name? But that's impossible. I've never seen him before in my life." Rita shrugged, clearly uncomfortable. "Could be more confusion from the heat. But he definitely said Daniel Mercer several times." Daniel watched as they loaded the stretcher into the ambulance, his mind racing. How could a stranger know his name? He hadn't introduced himself during the rescue, and the man had been barely conscious the entire time. The ambulance doors closed with a solid thunk. The siren remained silent as the vehicle pulled away, red lights flashing in the morning sun. Daniel stood there for a long moment, watching until it disappeared around a bend in the road. Lily's voice broke through his thoughts. "Dad? Are you okay?" Daniel forced a smile, pushing his unease aside. His children had been through enough excitement for one morning. "I'm fine, sweetie. Just thinking." He clapped his hands together, trying to inject some cheerfulness into his voice. "How about we head into town and get some breakfast? I don't know about you two, but I'm starving." "Can we go to Mary's Diner?" Jacob asked, some of his usual energy returning. "They have those. Chocolate chip pancakes." "Chocolate chip pancakes it is," Daniel agreed, unlocking their truck. He helped Lily and Jacob remove their backpacks, stowing them behind the seat. The normalcy of the action helped steady him, even as questions about the runner's strange behavior lingered in his mind. The truck's air conditioning offered blessed relief from the oppressive heat as Daniel started the engine. In the rearview mirror, he could see his children settling into their seats, the morning's tension slowly easing from their shoulders. The forest trail disappeared behind them as Daniel turned onto the main road, heading back toward town. "Dad?" Lily's voice was quiet but steady. "What he said before? About us needing to run. Do you think he was really just confused from the heat?" Daniel met her eyes in the mirror, seeing the worry there. "That's exactly what it was, Lily. Heat exhaustion can make people say strange things. The EMTs will take good care of him." She nodded, but Daniel could tell she wasn't entirely convinced. He wasn't sure he was either, but right now his children needed reassurance more than they needed his doubts. "I'm thinking about ordering a side of bacon with those pancakes," Daniel said, deliberately changing the subject, "maybe even extra crispy." "Extra crispy is the only way," Jacob chimed in. And just like that, the conversation turned to breakfast preferences and away from the unsettling events of the morning. As they drove toward town, the ambulance's red lights no longer visible in the distance, Daniel tried to focus on the promise of a family breakfast rather than the inexplicable whisper of his name from a stranger's lips. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Daniel's old pickup truck rolled into their driveway. The cracked asphalt radiated waves of heat, and the small patch of lawn in front of their duplex had already turned brown from the relentless July weather. Inside the truck, the air conditioning wheezed weakly, barely taking the edge off the sweltering temperature. "Home sweet home," Daniel said, trying to sound upbeat despite the morning's unsettling events. He glanced at Lily and Jacob in the rearview mirror. Their faces were still drawn with concern. Inside, the duplex felt stuffy despite the window unit humming at full blast. Daniel headed straight for the kitchen, pulling bread and sandwich fixings from the fridge. The familiar routine of making lunch helped steady his hands, which hadn't stopped trembling since their encounter with the mysterious runner. "Who wants turkey?" he called out, arranging slices of bread on the counter. "And we've got some of that cheese you like, Jake." Jacob slumped into a kitchen chair. "I'm not really hungry, Dad. You need to eat something," Daniel insisted gently. "It's been a long morning." Lily lingered in the doorway, arms crossed. "That man knew your name, didn't he?" Daniel focused on spreading mayonnaise. keeping his movements deliberate and calm. The EMT probably told him while they were helping him. He was confused from the heat, remember? But Lily started. "Let's just eat," Daniel interrupted, sliding plates across the table. "Everything's okay now." They ate in uncomfortable silence, broken only by the rhythmic drone of the air conditioner and the clink of glasses against the worn Formica tabletop. Daniel forced himself to take measured bites of his sandwich, though his appetite had vanished. The knock at the door made them all jump. Through the window, Daniel spotted the white and blue patrol car parked at the curb. A deputy stood on their small concrete porch, adjusting his hat against the glare. "Stay here," Daniel told the kids, moving to answer the door. The wooden floor creaked beneath his feet. The deputy was young, probably in his early 30s, with a clean-shaven face already shiny with sweat. "Mr. Mercer? I'm Deputy Collins. Do you have a minute to talk about the incident this morning?" Daniel stepped onto the porch, pulling the door mostly closed behind him. "Is everything all right?" "Well, sir, we've got a situation." The deputy pulled out a small notebook. "The runner you helped this morning, he disappeared from Cedar Ridge Memorial about an hour after being admitted." A chill ran down Daniel's spine despite the heat. "Disappeared?" "Left without being properly discharged. Thing is, he was still showing signs of severe dehydration. The doctors wanted to keep him for observation, start an IV." The deputy shifted his weight. "But that's not the main reason I'm here." He reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a folded paper napkin sealed in an evidence bag. This was found in his room after he left. Daniel took the bag with trembling fingers. Written in shaky but precise handwriting were the words, "Forgive me, tell him I tried." Below that was Daniel's exact address, including their unit number at the duplex. The sound of blood rushing filled his ears. "I don't understand. I've never seen that man before in my life." The door creaked open behind him. "Dad?" Lily's voice was small. "What's going on?" Daniel turned to find both his children hovering in the doorway, faces pale with worry. "Why does he keep acting like he knows us?" Lily demanded, her voice cracking slightly. "I wish I knew, sweetheart." Daniel handed the evidence bag back to the deputy. "Have you identified him?" "Not yet. He gave the hospital a name, but it appears to be false. We're checking security footage now." The deputy tucked the napkin away. "If he attempts to contact you again, call us immediately. We'll have patrols keeping an eye on your street for the next few days, just as a precaution." After the deputy left, Daniel ushered the kids back inside. He tried to distract them with a movie, but neither seemed interested. Eventually, they retreated to their rooms, leaving Daniel alone with his thoughts. He grabbed a glass of water and settled into the weathered wooden chair on the porch. The afternoon heat pressed down like a heavy blanket, and cicadas droned endlessly in the trees lining their quiet street. Daniel stared at the passing cars, searching for answers in the shimmer of heat waves rising from the pavement. Nothing made sense. The runner's desperate warning, his mysterious disappearance, the note with their address, it all swirled in Daniel's mind like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite fit together. The ice in his glass clinked as his hand shook slightly, and he forced himself to take slow, deep breaths. Around him, the neighborhood carried on as usual. Mrs. Henderson from next door watered her withering petunias. Children's laughter drifted from somewhere down the block, but Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted this morning, that their ordinary life had somehow tilted off its axis. He sat there as the sun crept across the sky, while the cicadas hummed their endless summer song, wondering what exactly the stranger had tried and failed to do. The evening crept over Cedar Ridge like a heavy blanket, bringing little relief from the day's oppressive heat. In their small duplex kitchen, Lily stood at the counter, methodically chopping vegetables for a simple pasta dinner. The steady rhythm of her knife against the cutting board provided a comforting backdrop to the muted sounds of the television in the living room, where Jacob sprawled on their worn couch, flipping through channels. Daniel sat in his favorite armchair, a paperback novel open in his lap, but his eyes kept drifting to the windows. The events of the morning felt surreal now. The collapsed runner, his cryptic warning, the hospital disappearance, and that note with their address. Every shadow that moved across the walls made his shoulders tense. "Dad?" Lily's voice cut through his thoughts. "The water's boiling. Should I add the pasta now?" Daniel blinked, realizing he'd been staring at the same page for the last 10. "Yeah, honey, go ahead." He watched as she carefully measured out the spaghetti, breaking the long strands in half, just like her mother used to do. The familiar gesture made his chest ache. "This show is boring," Jacob announced, continuing to channel surf. "Everything's boring tonight. Maybe because you've changed channels 50 times in the last 5 minutes," Lily retorted, but her tone was gentle. Daniel knew his children well enough to recognize their attempts at normal conversation were masking their own unease about the day's events. The living room felt smaller than usual, the walls closer. Daniel couldn't shake the sensation of being observed, as if invisible eyes were tracking their every movement through the windows. He'd drawn most of the curtains earlier, telling himself it was to keep out the heat, but knowing it was more than that. "Dinner's almost ready," Lily called out, stirring the pasta sauce. The familiar smell of garlic and herbs filled the small space, but even this couldn't fully dispel Daniel's growing anxiety. At 9:15 p.m., his phone buzzed sharply against the side table, making him jump. The notification showed it was from their basic home security camera, a recent purchase he'd made after a string of car break-ins in the neighborhood. Movement detected. Daniel's throat went dry. He opened the app with slightly trembling fingers, expanding the grainy feed that showed their small driveway and the street beyond. At first, he saw nothing unusual in the dim glow of the single streetlight that stood at the edge of their property. Then, he saw him. A figure stood perfectly still at the end of their driveway, just where the cracked asphalt met the street. The streetlight above flickered erratically, creating a strobe-like effect that made the scene even more unsettling. In those brief illuminated moments, Daniel could make out the lean build, the runner's stance, the same posture he'd seen that morning on the trail. "Dad?" Jacob's voice seemed to come from very far away. "What's wrong?" Daniel couldn't look away from his phone screen. The figure took one deliberate step backward, then another, each movement careful and measured. The streetlight gave one final sputter, and when it steadied again, the man had vanished into the darkness beyond its reach. Fear exploded in Daniel's chest like a firecracker, sending him to his feet so quickly his book clattered to the floor. "Lily! Jacob! Come here! Right now!" Something in his voice must have conveyed the urgency because both children immediately responded. Lily abandoned the stove, and Jacob vaulted over the back of the couch, despite being told 100 times not to do that. "What is it?" Lily asked, her face pale in the kitchen light. "I need you both to stay close," Daniel said, trying to keep his voice steady. He moved quickly through the duplex, checking each window lock with trembling fingers. "No one goes near the windows, understand?" Jacob pressed close to his sister. "Dad, you're scaring us." "I'm sorry," Daniel said, pausing in his security check to pull both children into a quick hug. He could feel Lily's rapid heartbeat against his chest. I need to make sure we're safe." The pasta water boiled over on the stove with a loud hiss, making them all jump. Lily hurried to turn off the burner, her hands shaking slightly as she moved the pot. "It was him, wasn't it?" she asked quietly. "The man from this morning?" Daniel nodded, not wanting to lie to them. "I think so, but we're okay. We're inside. The doors are locked, and I'm right here." He finished checking every window, drawing curtains tight across each one. The duplex felt like a fortress now, but also somehow more vulnerable, as if sealing themselves in had only highlighted their isolation. Jacob sat on the couch, hugging a throw pillow to his chest. "Maybe we should call the police again?" "And tell them what?" Lily asked, sinking down beside him. "That someone might have been standing on the public street?" "Your sister's right," Daniel said, though it pained him to admit it. "We don't have anything concrete to report. Yet," he added silently. The three of them huddled in the living room, the abandoned dinner cooling on the stove. The television continued to play quietly in the background, some sitcom's laugh track creating an eerily inappropriate soundtrack to their fear. Daniel stood at the living room window, his fingers gripping the edge of the curtain. Through the narrow gap, he stared out at the now empty street. The streetlight cast its steady glow once again, illuminating nothing but parked cars and silent houses. But he couldn't shake the certainty that the runner would return. The man had found their home once. What would stop him from coming back? His fingers tightened on the curtain as he maintained his vigil, standing guard over his children, feeling more alone and exposed than he had since losing his wife. The night pressed against the windows like a living thing, full of shadows and secrets. And somewhere out there, a stranger who knew his name waited in the darkness. The digital clock on the microwave blinked 10:03 p.m., its green numbers casting a sickly glow across the darkened kitchen. Daniel paced between windows, checking locks for the third time, while Lily and Jacob huddled together on the living room couch. The television hummed quietly in the background, more for its familiar comfort than entertainment. "Maybe we should call the police again," Lily whispered, her voice trembling. She pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself small. Daniel shook his head, running his fingers through his hair. They already did a sweep of the neighborhood. Found nothing. The runner's words from that morning echoed in his mind. "Get your children out of here. Run, now." At first, he dismissed it as heat-induced confusion, but now each word felt heavy with meaning. Jacob's voice broke through. Daniel's thoughts. "Dad, are we safe here?" His son's question hung in the air, filled with a vulnerability that made Daniel's chest ache. Daniel looked at his children's faces, Lily's pale complexion, Jacob's wide eyes, and made his decision. "Pack your bags," he said firmly. "We're leaving tonight." "Where are we going?" Lily asked, straightening up. "Somewhere safe." Daniel moved with sudden purpose, pulling out their old duffel bags from the hall closet. "Pack enough clothes for a few days. Grab your toothbrushes, phone chargers, only what you need." The kids hesitated for only a moment before springing into action. Daniel watched them disappear into their rooms, then pulled out his own backpack. He moved through the house with focused efficiency, gathering their passports, birth certificates, and insurance papers from the filing cabinet in his bedroom. His hands trembled slightly as he stuffed them into a manila envelope. In the kitchen, he grabbed some non-perishable snacks and water bottles. The house filled with the sounds of drawers opening and closing, zippers being pulled, and hurried footsteps. An image surfaced in Daniel's mind. A weathered farmhouse surrounded by rolling Kentucky hills, its wooden porch wrapping around like protective arms. His father's home. They hadn't spoken in nearly 5 years, not since that bitter argument at his wife's funeral. Pride and hurt had kept them apart, but now? "Kids," Daniel called out, "how quick can you be ready?" "Almost done," Jacob answered, emerging from his room with a stuffed backpack. His favorite comic books poked out from a side pocket. Lily appeared moments later, carrying her school backpack and a duffel bag. "Where are we actually going?" she asked again, her voice steadier now that they were taking action. Daniel took a deep breath. "Your grandfather's farm in Kentucky." Both children stared at him. They barely knew their grandfather, just a few faded photographs and scattered mentions over the years. "But I thought," Jacob started. "I know," Daniel cut in gently. "But right now, we need somewhere off the grid. Somewhere nobody would think to look for us. And whatever's happening." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Your grandfather's farm is about as far from trouble as we can get." They worked together to load the truck, moving quickly but quietly in the darkness. Daniel kept watching the street, but the shadowy figure didn't return. The neighborhood remained still, houses dark except for porch lights casting pools of yellow on empty driveways. Back inside, Daniel did one final sweep of the house. He unplugged appliances, checked windows, and grabbed their phone chargers. In the kitchen, he scribbled a note to their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Martinez, asking her to keep an eye on the house. At 10:55 p.m., Daniel ushered the kids into the truck. Lily claimed the front passenger seat while Jacob sprawled across the back, already wrapped in his favorite blanket. Their bags were secured in the truck bed, covered with a tarp against the chance of rain. Daniel slid behind the wheel, inserted the key, and paused. The events of the day felt surreal. The collapsed runner, the warning, the hospital disappearance, the figure in the driveway. Was he overreacting? Moving his children from their home in the middle of the night based on cryptic warnings and shadows? But then he remembered the precise way his address had been written on that hospital napkin, and his resolve strengthened. Better cautious than sorry when it came to his children's safety. At exactly 11 p.m., Daniel backed the truck out of their driveway. The moon hung full and bright above them, painting silver streaks across the hood of the truck. Cedar Ridge slept peacefully around them as they drove through familiar streets that suddenly felt foreign and threatening. Jacob's voice drifted up from the back seat, small and tired. "How long until we get there?" "About 4 hours, Daniel," answered, glancing in the rearview mirror. "Try to get some sleep." As they merged onto the highway heading south, Daniel caught one last glimpse of Cedar Ridge in his side mirror. The town's water tower stood silhouetted against the starlit sky, a landmark he'd seen thousands of times before. But tonight, it felt like a goodbye. The headlights of Daniel's old pickup truck cut through the darkness as he guided the vehicle south along Interstate 75. The gentle hum of the engine and soft whirring of tires against asphalt filled the cab, In the passenger seat, Lily had curled up against the window, her blonde hair falling across her face like a protective curtain. Jacob lay sprawled across the back seat, his gangly teenage limbs wrapped in Daniel's old flannel jacket. Daniel lifted the gas station coffee cup to his lips, grimacing at the bitter taste. The dashboard clock read 12:47 a.m. His eyes felt gritty, but the caffeine and nervous energy kept him alert. Every few minutes, he checked the rearview mirror, watching for headlights that might follow too closely or for too long. The interstate stretched empty before him, a ribbon of black cutting through Ohio's farmland. As city lights faded behind them, memories he'd long suppressed began floating to the surface. His father's weathered face appeared in his mind, Caleb Mercer, standing ramrod straight in his kitchen 5 years ago, jaw clenched tight as Daniel had stormed out of the house. "You're living in the past, Dad," Daniel had shouted that day. "The world's changed. You need to change with it." But Caleb hadn't changed. 25 years in the military had carved him into something unmovable, like the Kentucky limestone that broke so many farmers' plows. The argument that day had started over Lily's then-boyfriend, a kind-hearted black kid named Marcus. Caleb's comments had been subtle at first, loaded with old prejudices masked as concern. But they'd grown worse, until Daniel couldn't stand it anymore. Daniel's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The last thing he'd said to his father was that his grandchildren deserved better. Now, here he was, driving them straight to Caleb's doorstep. He passed a sign for Georgetown, Kentucky. The coffee cup was empty, and his thoughts drifted to earlier memories. Caleb teaching him to fish in the creek behind the farmhouse. The proud nod when Daniel had hit his first home run in Little League. But always there had been that distance, the military precision, the unspoken expectations, the inability to show affection except through stern lectures about responsibility and duty. The radio played softly, some country station that kept fading in and out. Daniel thought about his own parenting, how desperately he tried to be different from his father. Where Caleb had been rigid, Daniel aimed for flexibility. Where Caleb had been silent, Daniel tried to communicate. But in the end, was he any better? Here he was, running from danger in the middle of the night, with no real plan except to seek shelter from a man he'd sworn never to speak to again. A sign for a rest stop appeared, and Daniel pulled in, needing to stretch his legs and check on the kids. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a few semi-trucks with their engines idling. He carefully opened his door, trying not to wake Lily or Jacob. The night air was thick with humidity. Crickets chirped in the darkness beyond the fluorescent lights. Daniel walked a few paces, working the stiffness from his legs. The runner's warning echoed in his mind. "Get your children out of here. Run, now." Well, they were running. But what were they running from? Back in the truck, Jacob stirred briefly as Daniel settled behind the wheel. "Where are we, Dad?" "Kentucky," Daniel whispered. "Go back to sleep, buddy." The boy's eyes closed immediately, and Daniel pulled back onto the interstate. The miles rolled by, and the sky began to lighten imperceptibly in the east. He passed. Signs for Lexington, then smaller towns he remembered from his childhood. Winchester, Mount Sterling, Moorhead. Around 5:30 he turned off the main highway onto smaller county roads. The landscape grew more familiar, rolling hills covered in tobacco fields and horse pastures. Mist clung to the hollows between hills like cotton batting, and the early morning light painted everything in shades of gray and pearl. Lily woke as they turned onto the dirt road leading to the farmhouse. "Is this?" she started to ask. Daniel nodded. "Your grandfather's place." She sat up straighter, smoothing her hair. "Does he know we're coming?" "No," Daniel admitted, navigating the truck around a particularly deep rut in the road. The farmhouse appeared ahead, a 2-story white structure that looked smaller than he remembered, its paint peeling in places. A rusty Ford pickup sat in the gravel driveway, and smoke rose from the chimney. Of course, his father had always been an early fire riser. Jacob stirred in the back seat. "Are we there?" Daniel parked the truck and turned off the engine. The sudden silence felt heavy. "Yeah, we're here." "Listen, both of you, I know this isn't ideal. Your grandfather, he can be difficult. But we need a safe place right now, and this is it." They climbed out of the truck, stretching tired muscles. The morning air smelled of wet grass and wood smoke. A rooster crowed somewhere in the distance. Daniel led his children up the wooden steps to the front porch, each board creaking exactly as he remembered. Before he could knock, the screen door opened. Caleb Mercer stood in the doorway, dressed in worn jeans and a flannel shirt. His silver haircut, military short, as always. His eyes widened as he took in the sight of his son and grandchildren standing there, their presence as unexpected as snow in summer. For a long moment, no one spoke. The morning mist swirled around their feet, and somewhere in the fields, a mourning dove called. The screen door creaked open at exactly 6 in the morning. Caleb Mercer's tall frame filled the doorway, his weathered face showing no emotion as he took in the sight of his son and grandchildren standing on his front porch. The early morning light cast long shadows across the worn wooden boards beneath their feet. "Dad," Daniel said softly, his voice carrying the weight of their 5-year silence. Caleb's eyes moved from Daniel to the teenagers. His expression softened slightly at the sight of them, though his jaw remained set. After what felt like an eternity, he gave a single, curt nod and stepped aside. "Come on in," he said, his voice gruff from lack of use. The farmhouse kitchen looked exactly as Daniel remembered it. The same faded yellow curtains his mother had sewn decades ago. The ancient copper-bottomed pots hanging above the stove. The scarred oak table that had hosted countless family meals. The familiar smell of coffee and bacon hung in the air. "Sit, Caleb," instructed, pulling out chairs. "Was making breakfast anyway." Lily and Jacob exchanged uncertain glances before sliding into their seats. Daniel noticed how small they looked at the big table, how tired their faces were after the long drive. Caleb moved around the kitchen with military precision, placing plates of eggs and bacon in front of each of them. "You want to tell me what brings you here at dawn?" Caleb asked, settling into his chair at the head of the table, his steel-gray eyes fixed on Daniel. Daniel pushed his eggs around with his fork. "We needed somewhere safe to stay, just for a little while." "Safe from what?" Caleb's voice sharpened. "It's complicated," Daniel replied, avoiding his father's gaze. We need to lay low for a bit." Caleb studied his son's face, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the tension in his shoulders. His military training had taught him to read people, and everything about Daniel's posture screamed fear. "Your kids look exhausted," Caleb observed, his tone softening slightly. "When's the last time you all slept?" "Yesterday," Jacob piped up, then quickly looked down when both adults turned to him. Lily remained silent, picking at her bacon with careful deliberation. Her eyes kept darting around the kitchen, taking in details. The old rifle mounted above the doorway, the collection of wooden ducks lined up on the windowsill, the stack of well-worn farming magazines on the counter. Caleb cleared his throat. "Well, you can stay. Got the space." He paused, adding gruffly, "Your mother would have wanted that." Daniel's throat tightened at the mention of his mother. She'd been gone for 15 years, but her absence still echoed through the house. "Thanks, Dad." After breakfast, while Caleb cleared the dishes with mechanical efficiency, Lily and Jacob began exploring the first floor of the farmhouse. Daniel watched as they discovered the layers of family history scattered throughout the rooms. In the living room, Jacob stopped in front of a wall of photographs. "Dad, is this you?" he asked, pointing to a faded picture of a young boy in baseball uniform. Daniel moved closer, memories washing over him. "Yeah, that was my Little League team. I was about your age." Lily's attention was drawn to a glass display case filled with military medals and patches. "Grandpa was in the Army?" she asked quietly. 25 years? Daniel answered, noticing how Caleb's shoulders stiffened at the kitchen sink. "Special Forces." The teenagers continued their exploration, finding old farming tools mounted on walls, dusty books about military history, and more family photos. Daniel's chest ached as he realized how much of their family story his children had never known. In one corner, a model airplane sat on a shelf, its red paint chipped but still bright. Daniel remembered building it with his father one summer afternoon, before the arguments started, before the silence grew too thick to break through. Caleb emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "Upstairs rooms are still made up," he said. "Show you where you can sleep." They followed him up the creaking staircase. The upstairs hallway was narrow, with 4 doors leading off it. Caleb pointed to the first 2 rooms. "Lily can take your Aunt Sarah's old room," he said. "Jacob, you'll be in the room your father used to have." He glanced at Daniel. "Guest rooms at the end of the hall." The rooms were clean, but frozen in time. Sarah's room still had pale pink walls and dried flowers in a vase on the dresser. Daniel's old room contained model airplanes hanging from the ceiling and faded posters of cars on the walls. "Bathrooms across the hall," Caleb added, towels in the cabinet. His words were practical, efficient, like a military briefing. Jacob and Lily dragged their backpacks into their respective rooms, both looking overwhelmed by the sudden immersion in their father's past. Caleb retreated downstairs, without another word, his heavy footsteps echoing through the old house. Daniel stood alone in the guest room, watching dust motes dance in the morning sunlight streaming through the window. The room was spare, just a bed, dresser, and chair, but spotlessly clean. His mother's touch was still visible in the hand-stitched quilt on the bed, the pressed flower arrangement on the wall. Outside, the sun continued its slow climb over the Kentucky hills, painting the farmland in shades of gold. From his window, Daniel could see the barn, the old tractor, the field stretching toward the horizon, all exactly as he remembered, yet somehow different now that he was seeing them through adult eyes. The weight of the past 5 years of silence, and all the unspoken words that had built that silence, seemed to press down on him in this room. But beneath that weight was something else, the deep-rooted feeling of being home, despite everything that had happened. Through the thin walls, he could hear his children moving around in their rooms, unpacking their hastily gathered belongings. Their presence here, in this house filled with his own childhood memories, created a strange overlap of past and present that made his head spin. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, the old springs creaking beneath him. The morning sun grew stronger, flooding the room with light. While downstairs, the familiar sound of his father's heavy boots on the kitchen floor marked the beginning of another day on the farm. The Sunday morning sun streamed through the farmhouse windows as Daniel helped Jacob straighten his collar. They hadn't packed church clothes, but Caleb had insisted they make do with what they had. Daniel's wrinkled polo shirt and the kids' casual wear would have to suffice. "Can't have folks thinking I'm hiding you all away," Caleb had said over breakfast, his tone leaving no room for argument. "People talk in small towns." Lily stood by the mirror in the hallway, fidgeting with Demonis. "Her hair. Do we really have to go?" she whispered to Daniel when Caleb walked past. "We don't even know these people." Daniel placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Just for today, honey. Maybe it'll help us feel more normal." The drive to church was quiet, broken only by the crunch of gravel under the truck's tires. The white clapboard building sat nestled among tall oaks, its steeple reaching toward the cloudless sky. Cars filled the small parking lot, mostly pickup trucks and well-worn sedans. As they approached the entrance, a woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes stepped forward to greet them. She wore a flowing blue dress that seemed to match her gentle demeanor. "You must be Caleb's family," she said, her smile reaching all the way to her eyes. "I'm Grace Holloway, the pastor's wife. We've been hoping to meet you for years." Daniel noticed how she didn't mention their sudden appearance or ask why they were there. Instead, she focused on Jacob and Lily, speaking to them directly rather than over their heads. "We have a wonderful youth group that meets during service," she told them. "Jacob, there's a boy about your age who loves building model planes. And Lily, I think you'd fit right in with our high school group. They're planning a photography project for the church bulletin." Lily's eyes flickered with interest at the mention of photography, though she tried to hide it. Jacob shuffled his feet but looked less anxious than he had all morning. Inside, the church was cool and dim, with sunlight filtering through stained glass windows. The wooden pews gleamed with decades of use and care. As they found seats, Daniel noticed how Caleb nodded to various members, receiving respectful nods in return. His father might be stern, but he clearly had a place here. Throughout the service, Daniel watched his children gradually relax. Jacob had indeed found the boy Grace mentioned, and they were whispering about airplane designs between hymns. Even Lily's shoulders had lost some of their tension as she sat with a group of girls her age. After the final prayer, the congregation moved to the fellowship hall for coffee and cookies. People approached them with genuine warmth, offering handshakes and introducing themselves. Daniel maintained a polite distance, answering questions vaguely when asked about their visit, but he couldn't help noticing how naturally his kids were mixing with the others. "They're resilient, aren't they?" Grace appeared beside him, holding 2 cups of coffee. She offered one to Daniel. Children often are, but they still need safe spaces to process their feelings. Daniel accepted the coffee, studying her face. There was no prying in her expression, only genuine concern. "I run a youth counseling program," she continued softly. "Nothing formal, just a listening ear when needed. If Lily or Jacob ever want to talk," she let the offer hang in the air. "Thank you," Daniel said, meaning it. "It's been a difficult time." Grace nodded, understanding in her eyes. Sometimes the hardest part is admitting we need help. Your children are welcome here, Daniel. So are you. Across the room, Jacob was laughing at something his new friend had said, while Lily sat with three girls who were showing her something on a phone, probably photography related, given her engaged expression. Even Caleb seemed different here, less rigid as he spoke with a group of older men. The drive back to the farmhouse was lighter, somehow. Jacob chattered about his new friend's model airplane collection, and Lily mentioned the youth group's upcoming photo project. Caleb drove in silence, but Daniel caught him glancing in the rearview mirror at his grandchildren, something soft crossing his features. At the farmhouse, as they prepared for lunch, Daniel noticed the morning's tension had eased slightly. The kitchen felt less cramped, the silence less heavy. Grace's kindness and the congregation's welcome had created a small crack in their defensive wall. Not enough to let their guard down completely, but enough to breathe a little easier. Caleb pulled plates from the cupboard, and for the first time since their arrival, his movements seemed less mechanical, more purposeful. "The Holloways are good people," he said quietly, not looking at Daniel. "Always have been." It wasn't much, but in the language of Mercer men, it was an offering of sorts. Daniel nodded, accepting it for what it was, as they began setting the table for lunch. The afternoon heat pressed down on the farmhouse as Daniel and Caleb made their way to the storage shed. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams that pierced through the weathered wooden slats. The musty smell of old tools and forgotten memories filled the air. "Been meaning to clean this out for years," Caleb said, pulling open the creaking door. "Might as well put you to work while you're here." Daniel nodded, rolling up his sleeves. The shed was packed with boxes, farm, equipment, and odds and ends from decades of life on the property. They worked in silence at first, sorting through items into keep and trash piles. Kids seemed to be settling in okay. Caleb mentioned, his voice gruff but carrying a hint of concern. "They're adaptable," Daniel replied, lifting a heavy box of old magazines. "More than I am, probably." Through the shed's grimy window, he could see Lily and Jacob exploring the overgrown garden. Lily had her camera out, probably capturing close-ups of wildflowers, while Jacob poked at something with a stick. It was good to see them acting like normal kids again, even if just for a moment. Caleb grunted as he shifted an old trunk. "This needs sorting too." He opened it, revealing a collection of military memorabilia, medals, photographs, and various personal items from his service years. Daniel watched his father methodically go through the contents. Caleb's movements suddenly stopped, his weathered hands holding something small and metallic. "What is it?" Daniel asked, noticing the change in his father's expression. Caleb held up a military watch, its face scratched but still intact. "Haven't seen this in." His voice trailed off as he turned it over, revealing an engraving on the back. S.H. "Brothers in Arms?" Daniel read aloud, moving closer. "Samuel Hawkins," Caleb said quietly. "We called him Hawk." His fingers traced the engraving. "Best man in our unit. Saved my life more than once." Daniel felt a chill despite the heat. The runner's face flashed in his mind. The same angular features, the same intense eyes, but that was impossible. This watch belonged to someone from decades ago. "What happened to him?" Daniel asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Caleb's jaw tightened. "Lost track after 91. There was an incident." He placed the watch carefully on a nearby shelf. "Some things are better left in the past." Before Daniel could press further, Lily's voice called from outside. "Dad, come look at this." Daniel stepped out of the shed, grateful for the interruption. The kids stood at the edge of the property where the maintained lawn gave way to woods. Jacob pointed at the ground. "Look what we found," he said excitedly. "Tire tracks." Daniel knelt to examine the marks in the soft earth. They were fresh, probably from the last day or two. Something about them made his stomach twist, but he forced a casual smile. "Probably just hunters," he said, standing up and brushing dirt from his knees. "They sometimes cut through these back roads." Lily frowned, her photographer's eye for detail catching something else. "But Dad, they come right up to the property line and then turn around." "Why would hunters—" "Let's head inside," Daniel interrupted, perhaps too quickly. "It's getting hot out here." The rest of the afternoon passed slowly. They finished organizing the shed, though Caleb seemed distracted after finding the watch. Daniel caught him looking at it several times, lost in thought. Dinner was quiet, filled with the clinking of forks and the hum of the old ceiling fan. Lily talked about the photos she'd taken, Jacob about a frog he'd found. But Daniel's mind kept circling back to the watch and those tire tracks. Now, lying in the guest room bed, Daniel stared at the ceiling fan making lazy circles above him. The house creaked and settled around him, each sound making him more alert. The initials from the watch, SH, seemed to flow before his eyes every time he closed them. The runner's warning echoed in his mind. "Get your children out of here. Run, now." Daniel turned onto his side, trying to find a comfortable position on the unfamiliar mattress. Through the window, moonlight cast tree branch shadows on the wall. They seemed to reach toward him like grasping fingers. Sleep remained elusive as his thoughts churned. The watch couldn't be connected to the runner. It was too much of a coincidence, too impossible. Yet the similarity in their faces, the way his father had reacted to finding the watch. A floorboard creaked somewhere in the house, and Daniel's eyes snapped open. Just the old house settling, he told himself, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the puzzle pieces were there, just out of reach. The initials on the watch seemed burned into his mind as he lay there, waiting for a dawn that felt too far away. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Daniel's phone buzzed against the bedside table. He reached for it groggily, assuming his boss from the construction company was calling about the days he'd missed. The screen showed an unknown number. Daniel sat up in the unfamiliar guest bed, running a hand through his hair. One new voicemail. He pressed play, holding the phone to his ear. A man's voice, strained and urgent, filled his head. "The truth you never knew is the danger you were never told. Protect your children from my mistakes." Daniel's hands began to shake. He played the message again, his heart pounding harder with each word. The voice seemed familiar, similar to the runner's, but different somehow. More worn, older maybe. He got dressed quickly, his mind racing. Downstairs, he found Caleb already at the kitchen table, reading a newspaper and drinking black coffee. "Sleep okay?" Caleb asked without looking up. "Fine," Daniel lied, pouring himself coffee with unsteady hands. The morning passed slowly. Daniel kept checking his phone, but no more messages came. Around noon, Lily announced she was going to look for extra blankets in the attic. The old farmhouse got surprisingly cold at night. "Watch out for spiders up there," Caleb warned, tossing her a flashlight. 20 minutes later, Lily's footsteps thundered down the attic stairs. She burst into the living room where Daniel sat trying to read a book. "Dad," she said, her voice tight. "Look what I found." She held out a photograph, its edges worn and color faded to sepia tones. Daniel took it carefully. The image showed a younger version of his father, maybe 30 years ago, standing next to another soldier. They were both in military uniform, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. Daniel's blood ran cold. The other man, younger, cleaner cut, but unmistakable, looked exactly like the runner from the trail. "Where did you find this?" Daniel asked, his mouth dry. "In an old album tucked behind some boxes," Lily said. "Dad, isn't that?" "Go find your brother," Daniel said quietly. "Stay downstairs." He found Caleb in the backyard, checking the garden fence. "We need to talk," Daniel said, holding up the photograph. Caleb turned, squinting at the image. His face hardened instantly, shoulders tensing like he was preparing for battle. "Who is he?" Daniel demanded. "The man in this picture, who is he?" "It's nothing you need to worry about," Caleb said flatly. "Nothing to worry about?" Daniel's voice rose. "A man who looks exactly like this showed up on our hiking trail, collapsed, warned us to run, then disappeared from the hospital. He knew my name, my address. And now I find out you knew him?" Caleb's jaw clenched. "That was a long time ago. Tell me who he is," I said. "It's nothing you need to worry about." Caleb turned away, starting to walk back toward the house. "My kids are scared," Daniel said. "We left our home because of this man. I deserve to know what's going on." Caleb stopped, but didn't turn around. His shoulders were rigid, his hands balled into fists at his sides. "Some things are better left in the past." "Dad, I'm not discussing this." Caleb's tone was final, military sharp. He strode into the house, letting the screen door slam behind him. Daniel stood in the humid evening air, staring at the photograph. The young soldier's face smiled up at him, frozen in time, while somewhere out there, his older self was trying to warn Daniel about something connected to his father's past. The cicadas buzzed in the trees as dust settled over the farm. Daniel's thumb traced the edge of the photograph, his mind spinning with questions his father refused to answer. The kitchen's dim overhead light cast long shadows across the worn wooden table where Daniel and his father sat facing each other. The old farmhouse creaked and settled around them in the late-night quiet. A half-empty coffee pot sat between them, the liquid inside long gone cold. Daniel placed the faded photograph on the table, sliding it toward Caleb with 2 fingers. "Tell me about him," he said quietly. "The man standing next to you in this picture." Caleb's weathered hands curled around his coffee mug. His eyes fixed on the photograph, but he didn't touch it. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the gentle ticking of the ancient wall clock. His name was Samuel Hawkins. Caleb finally said, his voice rough. "We called him Hawk." He paused, taking a slow breath. "He was my platoon partner, best soldier I ever served with." Daniel leaned forward, studying his father's face in the dim light. And he disappeared. Caleb's fingers tightened around the mug. Back in '82, after. He trailed off, his jaw working. After what? Caleb pushed back from the table, the chair legs scraping against the linoleum. He walked to the kitchen window, staring out into the darkness. His reflection showed a man carrying a heavy burden. "There was an incident," he said finally. "At the local bar in town, some drunk locals started hassling Hawk about being black, about serving with white soldiers. Things got ugly." Caleb's voice grew quieter. "Real ugly." Daniel watched his father's rigid posture, seeing the military bearing that never quite left him. "What happened?" "Hawk defended himself. One of the locals ended up in the hospital." Caleb turned back to face Daniel. "The police showed up, but instead of arresting the troublemakers, they went after Hawk, said he was the instigator." "That's not right," Daniel said, anger coloring his voice. "No, it wasn't." Caleb returned to the table, lowering himself heavily into his chair. "The local officials, they wanted to sweep it under the rug, protect their own. They were going to railroad him, Daniel. Make an example out of him." Daniel ran a hand over his face, feeling the late hour in his bones. "So he ran, disappeared one night, just gone." Caleb picked up the photograph, his thumb brushing over the image of the 2 young soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder. "I should have done more, should have stood up for him. But I was young, scared of making waves." "And you've been carrying this all these years?" Caleb set the photo down carefully. "I always knew someone might come looking, might want answers about what happened back then. Truth is, I've spent 40 years looking over my shoulder, wondering if the past would catch up. But why now?" Daniel leaned back, crossing his arms. "Why would Hawk come looking? For me specifically? I don't know." Caleb shook his head slowly. "That's what worries me. Hawk was a good man, Daniel, the best kind of soldier. But 40 years is a long time to carry anger." The coffee pot gurgled once, drawing both men's attention. Daniel stood and poured the remains down the sink, watching the dark liquid swirl away. "You should have told me this years ago." "I know." Caleb's voice was barely above a whisper. "I thought I was protecting you by keeping quiet. Seems I might have done the opposite." Daniel braced his hands against the counter, head bowed. The weight of his father's confession pressed down on him, mixing with his own fears for his children's safety. Through the kitchen window, he could see the stars scattered across the Kentucky sky, so much clearer here than in Cedar Ridge. The floorboards creaked behind him. He turned to find Lily standing in the doorway, her long hair messy from sleep. "Dad?" she said softly. "Is everything okay?" Daniel crossed the kitchen and put an arm around his daughter's shoulders. "Yeah, sweetheart, just talking with Grandpa." He glanced at Caleb, who had stood up straight, trying to compose himself. "Why don't you head back to bed? Are we leaving tomorrow?" Lily's voice held a note of worry. Daniel squeezed her shoulder gently. "No, we'll stay at least another day while I figure things out, I promise." Lily nodded, casting a curious look between her father and grandfather before padding back upstairs. Her footsteps faded, leaving the 2 men alone again in the dim kitchen. "Whatever's happening," Caleb said, his voice stronger now, "we'll face it together. I won't make the same mistake twice." Daniel looked at his father for a long moment, seeing not the stern military man of his childhood, but someone older, carrying regrets that had shaped both their lives. He nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of the truth that had finally emerged between them. The old wall clock struck midnight, its chimes echoing through the quiet house. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, understanding had replaced decades of silence. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the farmhouse kitchen as Grace Holloway's silver sedan pulled into the gravel driveway. Daniel watched through the window as she stepped out, her flowered dress catching the breeze, a warm smile already on her face. "Good morning," she called out, waving to Lily and Jacob, who were sitting on the porch steps. "The church is having an impromptu picnic today. Would you all like to join us?" Jacob perked up immediately, but Lily hesitated, looking to Daniel for guidance. He nodded encouragingly. After the heavy revelations of last night, they all needed a break from the tension. "There'll be plenty of young people your age," Grace added, her voice gentle and inviting, "and the best homemade food you'll find in 3 counties." The church field was alive with activity when they arrived. Checkered blankets dotted the grass, and folding tables groaned under the weight of covered dishes. Children darted between the adults, their laughter carried on the warm breeze. "Hey, Jacob!" A boy about Jacob's age waved from near a volleyball net. "We need one more for our team." Daniel watched as his son's face lit up. After a moment's hesitation, Jacob jogged over to join the game. His awkward stance slowly relaxed as the other teens welcomed him with easy chatter and friendly high fives. Lily lingered near Daniel until Grace introduced her to a group of girls sitting in a circle under an old oak tree. They were making friendship bracelets and immediately offered her colored threads and beads. To Daniel's surprise, Lily sat down with them, her shoulders gradually losing their defensive hunch. "Come meet some folks," Grace suggested to Daniel, leading him toward a cluster of men and women near the grills. The conversation flowed naturally around weather patterns, crop yields, and local politics. Daniel found himself drawn into their easy banter, sharing stories about his own small landscaping business back in Ohio. "My Jim used to do landscaping," said Martha, a silver-haired woman wearing an apron decorated with sunflowers. Before the accident, she touched Daniel's arm. "I lost him 5 years ago. The church family here, they carried me through." Other women joined in, sharing their own stories of loss and healing. There was Susan, whose daughter had battled cancer, and Beth, who had rebuilt her life after a devastating divorce. Their voices were strong, touched with both sadness and hope. "The first year's the hardest," Martha said softly. "But look there." She pointed to where Jacob was spiking the volleyball over the net, his face flushed with excitement as his teammates cheered. Nearby, Lily was actually laughing at something one of the girls had said, her fingers working deftly with the colored threads. "Sometimes healing comes in small moments," Grace added, appearing with a plate of peach cobbler. "Here, try some of this. It's my grandmother's recipe." The dessert was still warm, the buttery crust melting on Daniel's tongue. Around him, conversation hummed like honeybees and summer flowers. Children played tag between the trees, their shadows dancing on the sun-dappled grass. The aroma of grilled hamburgers mingled with the sweet scent of fresh-cut hay from the neighboring fields. As the afternoon stretched on, Daniel found himself relaxing into the gentle rhythm of community life. He watched Jacob learn to pitch horseshoes from a retired factory worker named Tom. Lily helped younger children make paper airplanes, her natural patience shining through as she showed them how to fold the wings just right. "Your kids are special," Martha said, settling next to Daniel on a wooden bench. "They've got good hearts. Just need some sunshine to help them bloom." Daniel nodded, emotion catching in his throat. Here, surrounded by the warmth of strangers who felt increasingly like friends, the weight he'd been carrying seemed a little lighter. The sun was starting to sink toward the horizon when Grace began organizing the cleanup. Everyone pitched in, packing leftover food into containers, folding chairs, and gathering scattered toys. The kids helped without complaint, caught up in the spirit of cooperation. "Take this peach cobbler home," Martha insisted, pressing a foil-wrapped dish into Daniel's hands. "There's plenty more where that came from." Jacob carried a paper plate stacked with chocolate chip cookies, a gift from his new volleyball friends. Lily clutched a handful of friendship bracelets and a promise to meet her new friends at youth group next week. The drive back to the farmhouse was filled with animated chatter. Jacob recounted every point he'd scored in volleyball, while Lily described the intricate patterns she'd learned for the bracelets. Their voices carried a lightness Daniel hadn't heard in months. As they pulled into the driveway, the porch light cast a welcoming glow. Their footsteps on the wooden steps were accompanied by laughter, the sound as sweet as the lingering taste of peach cobbler on their tongues. Martha's leftover containers felt warm in Daniel's hands as they stepped into the pool of light, their shadows stretching behind them like memories of a day well spent. The farmhouse had settled into its nighttime, quiet, creaking occasionally, as old houses do. Daniel sat in the kitchen, nursing a cup of chamomile tea while Lily and Jacob played cards at the dining table. The peaceful evening felt like a gentle exhale after the community picnic earlier that day. The knock came at 10 p.m. sharp, 3 firm raps that seemed to echo through the entire house. Daniel's hand froze mid-reach for his tea. Caleb, who had been reading in his worn leather armchair, stood up immediately, his weathered face tense. The kids stopped their card game, looking toward the door with wide eyes. "Stay here," Caleb commanded softly, moving toward the entrance with the careful steps of someone who had never fully left his military training behind. Through the window, beside the door, the porch light illuminated a familiar figure, Samuel "Hawk" Hawkins, leaning heavily against the doorframe. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, and he held his left arm close to his body. Caleb yanked the door open. For a moment, the two men just stared at each other, decades of history hanging in the air between them. "Mercer," Hawk said, his voice rough but steady. "Long time. Jesus, Hawk." Caleb's usual stoic expression cracked slightly. "You look like hell. Feel like it too." Hawk's attempted smile turned into a grimace. He stepped forward, stumbling slightly. Daniel moved quickly to help support him, and Hawk gripped his arm. "I wasn't crazy that day on the trail," he said, looking directly at Daniel. "There were men following you. Had been for days. I couldn't." He paused, catching his breath. Couldn't risk saying more with the kids there. Lily and Jacob watched from the dining room doorway, holding hands like they used to do when they were smaller and scared of thunderstorms. Daniel gestured for them to stay back. "Let's get him to the couch," Caleb said, helping Daniel guide Hawk to the living room. The injured man sank into the cushions with a barely suppressed groan. "I'll get the first aid kit," Daniel offered, but Caleb shook his head. "Kitchen cabinet above the fridge. There's a better one there." His voice carried the weight of someone who had patched up too many wounds in his lifetime. While Daniel gathered supplies, Hawk spoke quietly but clearly. "I disappeared back then because I had to. Those officials, they were willing to do anything to keep what happened buried. Would have killed me if I'd stayed." He looked at Caleb. "You remember." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Every damn day. Now their successor found out I'm still alive, still carrying that truth." Hawk winced as Daniel began cleaning a cut on his arm. "They want to finish what they started all those years ago." "Why target Daniel's family?" Caleb demanded, his voice rough with emotion. "Because they found out I've been watching over them," Hawk admitted. "Been keeping an eye on your son and grandkids from a distance for years. My way of," he paused, searching for words, "of making up for disappearing on you, Mercer. You stood by me back then, tried to help. I owed you." Daniel's hands stilled in their work. "You've been protecting us? All this time?" Hawk nodded slowly. "Your family became my family, in a way, even if you didn't know it." He looked at Lily and Jacob, still hovering uncertainly in the doorway. "I'm sorry I scared you kids on the trail. Was trying to warn your dad without saying too much." Something in Daniel's chest loosened a knot of fear and confusion, giving way to understanding and gratitude. This man had put himself at risk to keep them safe, had carried that responsibility silently for years. Caleb disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a glass of water, which he handed to Hawk with surprising gentleness. "You should have come to me sooner," he said gruffly. "Wasn't sure you'd want to see me," Hawk replied honestly. "Things were different back then. I'm different." Caleb's voice was quiet but firm. "We both are." Daniel watched as his father draped a warm blanket over Hawk's shoulders. The gesture seemed to bridge decades of silence and regret. Lily stepped forward hesitantly. "Do you want some of the leftover cobbler from the picnic?" she offered. "Mrs. Holloway said sugar helps with shock." Hawk's tired face softened into a genuine smile. "That would be mighty kind, young lady." Jacob followed his sister into the kitchen, returning with not just cobbler, but also a cup of the tea Daniel had been drinking earlier. As the family moved around Hawk, tending to his needs and listening to his story, Daniel felt something shift in the room's atmosphere. The walls that had separated them, all father from son, past from present, fear from understanding, seemed to thin and dissolve. Caleb settled into his armchair, keeping a watchful eye on his old friend. Daniel sat nearby, his children close. For the first time since arriving at the farmhouse, they felt like a real family, not perfect, not without their scars and complications, but united in purpose and care. The night deepened around the farmhouse, but inside, the light stayed warm and steady, holding them all in its protective glow. Morning sunlight painted golden streaks across the farmhouse yard as Daniel joined his father near the chicken coop. The air felt unusually calm and warm, carrying the sweet scent of summer hay. Inside the farmhouse, Hawk was resting on the living room couch, his injuries from the previous night being tended to by Grace Holloway, who had come by early with medical supplies. Daniel watched as Caleb scattered feed across the ground, the chickens clustering around his boots in a pecking frenzy. It was strange seeing his father like this, peaceful, methodical, almost gentle with the birds. For a moment, Daniel could almost forget the tension that had built between them over the years. "Here," Caleb said, handing Daniel a half-full bucket of feed. "Take the other side of the coop. They get ornery if you don't spread it even." Daniel accepted the bucket, noting how his father's hands were weathered but still strong. He began spreading the feed, mimicking Caleb's careful motion. The chickens divided their attention between them, clucking contentedly. "You're good with them," Daniel said, surprised to find himself wanting to break the silence. Caleb nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "They're simple, honest. Feed them, protect them, they give back what they can. No complications." The morning air grew warmer as they worked, and Daniel removed his light jacket. In the distance, the old barn stood tall against the blue sky. Its red paint faded but still proud. Everything felt deceptively normal, as if the previous night's revelations were just a bad dream. Then Jacob's voice cut through the morning calm. "Dad, the barn!" Daniel turned sharply. At first, he saw nothing unusual, but then thin wisps of gray smoke began curling from the barn's roof. Within seconds, the wisps thickened into dark plumes. "Fire!" Caleb shouted, already running toward the garden hose. "Daniel, get the other hose from the side of the house." Daniel sprinted for the house, his heart pounding. As he rounded the corner, an orange flame burst through one of the barn's upper windows, hungry and bright against the morning sky. "Lily, Jacob," Daniel called out. "Get away from the barn. Stay by the house." The kids, who had been playing near the porch, rushed to the safety of the farmhouse steps. Grace appeared in the doorway, her face pale with concern. "I'm calling the fire department," she announced, phone already in hand. Caleb had reached the garden hose and was unwinding it with practiced speed. Daniel found the second hose and turned the spigot full blast, but they both knew it wouldn't be enough. The fire was spreading too quickly, consuming the dry wood of the old barn like paper. Neighbors began appearing, having spotted the smoke from their properties. The Matthews family from the adjacent farm came running with their own hoses. Old Mr. Peterson arrived in his pickup truck, bringing extra buckets. "Form a line," Caleb commanded, his military training evident in his voice. "We need to contain it before it spreads." The improvised firefighting crew worked together, passing buckets and aiming hoses, but the flames seemed to mock their efforts. The heat became intense, forcing them to step back. The barn's wooden beams groaned ominously. Through the chaos, Daniel heard the farmhouse screen door slam. Hawk stood on the Faman porch, leaning heavily against the railing. His face was grim as he watched the barn burn, understanding dawning in his eyes. "They found us," Hawk said, his voice carrying across the yard despite its weakness. The words fell like stones into Daniel's stomach. The distant wail of fire truck sirens finally pierced the air. Within minutes, professional firefighters took over, their powerful hoses making real progress against the flames. But Daniel could see in their efficient movements that they were fighting a losing battle. The barn was already too far gone. As the flames were gradually brought under control, the acrid smell of smoke hung heavy in the air. The barn stood blackened and skeletal, water dripping from its charred frame. The firefighters began their methodical search through the ruins, and their grim faces told the story before they spoke. "This was deliberate," the fire chief announced, pointing to several spots where accelerant had been used. "Someone wanted this barn to burn, and burn fast." Sheriff's deputies arrived, their patrol cars kicking up dust as they pulled into the yard. They began taking photographs of the damage, marking evidence, and interviewing witnesses. The neighbors who had helped fight the fire lingered in concerned clusters, speaking in hushed voices. Mrs. Matthews brought over bottles of water and sandwiches she'd quickly made. "You all must be exhausted," she said, pressing food into Daniel's hands. "We're here if you need anything." Daniel watched as his children huddled close to Grace on the porch steps, their faces smudged with soot and worry. Caleb stood with the fire chief, pointing out various aspects of the barn's structure. And Hawk remained on the porch, his expression haunted, watching the deputies document the destruction that had been meant as a message. The morning's peaceful routine had been shattered, replaced by the stark reality of their situation. The gentle warmth of the day now felt oppressive, and the sweet summer air had turned bitter with smoke. As the deputies continued their work, snapping pictures and taking notes, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Grace Holloway stood in the charred doorway of the barn, her usually serene face creased with worry as she watched the last sheriff's deputy drive away. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the scorched timbers, and the acrid smell of smoke still hung heavy in the air. She turned to where the Mercers and Hawk huddled near Caleb's truck, their faces drawn with exhaustion and fear. "You can't stay here tonight," she said firmly, her voice gentle but leaving no room for argument. "The church basement is cool and secure. We have cots, blankets, and it's the safest place I can think of right now." Daniel glanced at his father, who nodded slowly. Even the stubborn old veteran couldn't deny the wisdom in Grace's words. Hawk, leaning heavily against the truck's tailgate, his face still pale from his injuries, spoke up. "She's right. They'll expect us to stay here." Within an hour, they had packed essential items into duffel bags. Grace's husband, Pastor Tom, helped them carry supplies through the church's side entrance and down the concrete steps into the basement. The space was vast and cool, smelling of old hymnals and furniture polish. Rows of metal folding chairs lined the walls, and sturdy wooden bookshelves held decades of church records and Sunday school materials. "It's not exactly the Hilton," Grace apologized as she switched on the fluorescent lights, which hummed to life overhead. The light revealed a clean but utilitarian space, with a small kitchenette in one corner and a couple of worn sofas arranged near a coffee table. "It's perfect," Daniel assured her, watching as Lily and Jacob explored their temporary shelter. The teenagers moved cautiously through the space, their sneakers squeaking against the linoleum floor. Jacob ran his fingers along the spines of old hymnals, while Lily examined a bulletin board covered with faded Sunday school artwork. Pastor Tom and Caleb set up 6 cots, arranging them in a rough circle near the kitchenette. They added foam mattress toppers and clean blankets, transforming the simple metal frames into somewhat comfortable beds. Hawk sank onto one gratefully, his face tight with pain. As evening settled in, Pastor Tom headed upstairs to lock up the church, leaving Grace to help the family settle. She pulled some board games from a cabinet and set out cookies and juice for the kids, trying to create a sense of normalcy in the abnormal situation. Later, while Lily and Jacob played a quiet game of chess on one of the sofas, and Caleb helped Hawk redress his wounds, Daniel found himself sitting with Grace at the small kitchen table. The old furnace hummed in the background, a steady drone that seemed to invite confession. "I don't even know where to begin," Daniel said, staring into the cup of coffee Grace had made. Everything was normal just days ago. Now." He trailed off, overwhelmed by the weight of recent events. Grace's kind eyes encouraged him to continue. She didn't push or pry, just listened with the patience of someone who had heard countless troubles over the years. "The runner, Hawk, he tried to warn us," Daniel continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I didn't understand. How could I? And now there's this whole history with my father, things I never knew about, corruption, cover-ups, and somehow my kids are caught in the middle of it all." "The truth has a way of surfacing," Grace said softly, "even when people try to bury it. But what matters now is keeping your family safe." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, exhaustion evident in every movement. "I've tried so hard since Sarah died to give them a stable life, to be enough for them. And now? Dad?" Lily's voice interrupted his thoughts. She and Jacob had abandoned their chess game and now stood near the table, their faces showing the strain of the past few days. "Should we try to go back home?" Jacob asked, his young voice trembling slightly. "Or maybe we could go somewhere else, like Aunt Jenny's in Michigan?" Daniel pushed back his chair and opened his arms. His children came to him immediately, and he hugged them close, feeling their fear in the way they clung to him. "Listen to me," he said firmly. "I promise you both, I will keep you safe. We'll figure this out together." Grace quietly excused herself, giving the family privacy. She busied herself in the kitchenette, preparing sleeping areas and laying out fresh towels near the basement's small bathroom. As the night deepened, exhaustion began to take its toll. Caleb settled onto his cot, his weathered face showing the strain of the day's events. Hawk had already fallen into a fitful sleep, his breathing steady but labored. Grace made sure everyone had enough blankets before heading upstairs to her own home, promising to return early, in the morning with breakfast. Daniel lay on his cot, listening to the familiar sounds of his children's breathing mixing with the steady hum of the church's old furnace. The basement was cool and dark, with only a small security light casting shadows on the ceiling. Despite their comfortable enough arrangements, sleep proved elusive. Lily tossed and turned on her cot, while Jacob had pulled his blanket up to his chin, making himself as small as possible. The events of the day, the fire, the hasty packing, the move to the church, had left them all shaken. The furnace cycled on again, its deep hum filling the basement with white noise. Daniel watched the shadows on the ceiling, his mind racing with questions about what tomorrow might bring. But for now, at least, his family was safe. They were together. And sometimes, he reminded himself, that had to be enough. Morning sunlight streamed through the high windows of the Cedar County Sheriff's Office, casting pale rectangles on the worn linoleum floor. Daniel sat beside his father in Sheriff Douglas Hale's modest office, surrounded by filing cabinets and decades-old wanted posters. The room smelled of coffee and paper, with a hint of the pine air freshener trying to mask it all. Sheriff Hale settled into his creaking desk chair, his weathered face serious as he spread several manila folders across his desk. His coffee cup, emblazoned with "World's Okayest Sheriff," sat untouched beside them. "I've been digging through old records all night," Hale began, his voice steady and measured. "What I found isn't pretty, but it explains why your friend Hawk has been running scared." Caleb shifted in his chair, his jaw tight. Daniel noticed his father's hands gripping the armrests, knuckles white with tension. "Back in '82," Hale continued, opening one of the folders, "there was an incident at the old mill. 3 black workers disappeared after reporting unsafe conditions. Hawk was investigating unofficially, gathering evidence that pointed to certain county officials being involved in a cover-up." Daniel leaned forward, his heart pounding. "And these officials tried to silence him?" "They did more than try," Hale said, pulling out a yellowed newspaper clipping. "They fabricated charges against him, threatened his family. That's why he vanished. But here's where it gets complicated. One of those officials had a son. That son now holds a position of power in the county government. Commissioner Marcus Fletcher," Caleb said quietly, the name coming out like a curse. Hale nodded grimly. "The very same. When word got around that the state was considering reopening the investigation into those disappearances, Fletcher panicked. He's been tracking Hawk for weeks, trying to prevent him from testifying." Daniel rubbed his temples, pieces falling into place. "So when Hawk collapsed on our trail, he wasn't just out for a morning run," Hale confirmed. "He'd been moving through back roads for days, trying to stay ahead of Fletcher's men. When he recognized you as Caleb's son, he tried to warn you without putting you directly in danger." The sheriff pulled out another document, this one newer. "We've got evidence that Fletcher hired private investigators to follow anyone who might have contact with Hawk. When Hawk approached your family, they started watching you too." Daniel felt a mix of relief and concern wash over him. "So, my kids were never the real target?" "No," Hale assured him. "But Fletcher's desperate. The barn fire was meant to scare Hawk out of hiding. He's getting reckless, which makes him dangerous." Caleb spoke up, his voice rough with emotion. "I should have come forward years ago, said what I knew about those disappearances. Maybe none of this would be happening now." Sheriff Hale leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. "Can't change the past, Caleb, but we can do right by it now. I've contacted the state police. They're sending investigators. Tomorrow morning. With Hawk's testimony and the evidence we've gathered, Fletcher won't be able to hide behind his family name anymore." Daniel thought of his children, huddled in the church basement with Hawk. "What about tonight? Are they safe?" "I've got deputies watching the church," Hale assured him. "Grace Holloway's got that basement locked down tighter than Fort Knox. Nobody's getting near your family without going through half the congregation first." The sheriff stood up, straightening his uniform. "Go back to them. Tell Hawk what we've learned. Let him know he doesn't have to run anymore." Daniel and Caleb rose, the weight of understanding settling between them. As they headed for the door, Hale called out one last time, "Daniel?" He turned back. "Your family got caught in the crossfire of something ugly, but you did right by protecting Hawk. Sometimes standing up for the truth means walking through fire to get there." The drive back to the church was quiet, each man lost. In his thoughts, the morning sun had grown stronger, burning away the last wisps of fog from the fields. When they pulled into the church parking lot, Daniel saw Mrs. Peterson from the congregation delivering what looked like enough casseroles to feed an army. Inside the cool basement, Lily and Jacob sat playing cards with Hawk at a folding table while Grace organized supplies nearby. They all looked up as Daniel descended the stairs, their faces expectant. "I need to talk to everyone," Daniel said, pulling up a metal folding chair. "The sheriff told us everything." One by one, he watched understanding dawn on their faces as he explained about Fletcher, about the old investigation, about why Hawk had been running. When he finished, the basement was quiet except for the steady hum of the ancient furnace. "So we're okay?" Jacob asked, his young voice breaking the silence. "The bad guys weren't really after us?" "Nobody," Daniel assured him, reaching over to squeeze his son's shoulder. "We just got caught in the middle of something bigger." Hawk set down his cards, his expression both relieved and determined. "I'm sorry you all got dragged into this, but thank you for helping me stay safe until the truth could come out." "That's what family does," Lily said suddenly, surprising everyone. She looked at Hawk with wise eyes that seemed older than her 16 years. "And you're kind of family now, aren't you?" A small smile crossed Hawk's tired face. "Yeah," he said softly. "I guess I am." The fellowship hall of First Baptist Church buzzed with quiet determination as neighbors filled the wooden folding chairs. Morning light filtered through stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across worried faces. Daniel stood at the front, his father beside him, watching as Grace Holloway guided more townspeople inside. Sheriff Hale positioned 2 deputies near the doors, while Hawk sat quietly in the front row, his shoulders tense, but his expression resolute. Lily and Jacob huddled close to their father, their eyes wide as they took in the gathering crowd. "I want to thank you all for coming," Daniel began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "What we're facing, it's bigger than just my family now." Grace stepped forward, her gentle presence immediately commanding attention. "We're here because this community stands together. Always has, always will." Sheriff Hale cleared his throat. "Mr. Hawkins has agreed to testify about the events from 30 years ago. We've got state investigators coming down tomorrow morning." Hawk slowly rose to his feet, turning to face the assembly. "What happened back then? The cover-up? The threats? It wasn't just about me. It was about this whole community being silenced by fear." His voice carried years of pain, but also strength. "I'm done running." Daniel watched as several older farmers nodded grimly, remembering those dark days. Mrs. Peterson, who ran the hardware store, stood up. "My late husband told me about those times, about how wrong it all was. We'll help keep you safe until justice is done." More voices joined in, offering support, shelter, protection. Someone mentioned taking turns watching the farm. Another suggested organizing meals. The local mechanic offered his garage as a safe house if needed. Lily tugged at Daniel's sleeve, whispering, "Dad, look at everyone. They really care." Jacob's eyes shone with a mix of pride and amazement. "It's like in those superhero movies when the whole town comes together." Daniel squeezed their shoulders, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. This was what community meant, not just houses on a map, but hearts linked by compassion and courage. Caleb had been quiet throughout the meeting, but now he stepped forward, his weathered face etched with emotion. "I need to say something." The room fell silent. 30 years ago, I chose silence over truth. I let fear rule me, and it cost me more than just my conscience. His voice cracked as he looked at Daniel. "It cost me my son." Daniel felt his throat tighten as decades of hurt and anger began to dissolve. He saw his father not as the harsh, distant man of his childhood, but as someone who had carried a heavy burden alone for far too long. "I watched good men stay quiet," Caleb continued, tears now running freely down his face. "Watched Hawk disappear, convinced myself it was for the best, that keeping my family safe meant keeping them in the dark. But that darkness, it followed us anyway." He turned to Daniel. "I'm sorry, son. I'm so sorry." Without thinking, Daniel stepped forward and embraced his father. The old man's shoulders shook as years of guilt and fear poured out. "I forgive you, Dad," Daniel whispered, his own tears falling. "We all do." Lily and Jacob moved closer, wrapping their arms around both men. The simple action bridged years of distance, healing wounds that had seemed too deep to mend. Grace wiped her eyes, then clapped her hand softly. "Well now, we've got work to do. Martha, you're organizing the meal schedule? And Tom, you'll coordinate the watch rotations?" The meeting shifted into practical planning. Sheriff Hale detailed security measures while community members volunteered resources and time. Through it all, Daniel kept his arm around his father's shoulders, feeling the weight of their shared history transform into something lighter, something hopeful. As the meeting concluded, two deputies approached Hawk. "Sir, we'll escort you to the station now. Need to get those statements recorded proper." Hawk stood, straightening his jacket. He paused by Daniel and Caleb. "Thank you both. For everything. We'll see you soon," Daniel assured him, watching as Hawk left with his police escort. Outside, the summer air had grown thick with humidity, but Daniel barely noticed. He guided his family toward their truck, where several neighbors were already loading supplies, groceries, tools for repairing the sun, barn's fire damage, even a freshly baked pie from Mrs. Peterson. "The Johnsons and Wilsons are heading to the farm now," Grace informed them. "They're starting on the barn repairs. Said they'll have the basic structure secure by nightfall." Daniel looked at his children, seeing how they stood taller now, more confident. Lily had her camera out, documenting the gathering of trucks and volunteers. Jacob was eagerly describing his mechanical knowledge to Tom Wilson, who nodded approvingly. They drove back to the farmhouse in a convoy of pickup trucks and cars. As they turned onto the dirt road, Daniel saw the burned barn in the distance, but now, instead of a symbol of threat, it had become a rallying point for healing and unity. Caleb sat in the passenger seat, his eyes fixed on the gathering of vehicles and people at his farm. "Never thought I'd see the day," he murmured. "All these folks coming together like this?" "Sometimes it takes darkness to show us where the light is," Daniel replied, parking near the house. They watched as neighbors unloaded lumber and tools, called out instructions, and began the work of rebuilding. The sight of so many hands joining together to help made the morning's fear feel distant, replaced by something stronger, hope, rooted in community and truth. The old courthouse loomed over the town square, its red brick walls catching the early morning sun. Daniel pulled into the parking lot, glancing at Hawk in the passenger seat. Despite his exhaustion, Hawk sat straight-backed, determined. "You ready for this?" Daniel asked softly. Hawk nodded, his eyes fixed on the courthouse steps. Been ready for decades. Inside, the air conditioning hummed as they made their way through security. Sheriff Hale met them in a wood-paneled conference room where state investigators waited with notepads and recording equipment. The blinds were drawn, creating a solemn atmosphere. For hours, Hawk's steady voice filled the room. He described that night. Decades ago, when he'd witnessed corrupt officials covering up racial violence. Names were named, dates given, documents produced from a worn leather briefcase he'd kept hidden all these years. Daniel listened, his heart heavy as Hawk detailed his years in hiding. Always watching, always careful. The investigator's pen scratched against paper, faces growing grimmer with each revelation. By late afternoon, arrest warrants were being prepared. Sheriff Hale dispatched deputies to multiple locations. Daniel watched through the conference room window as local news vans began gathering in the parking lot. Back at the church, Lily and Jacob had thrown themselves into helping Grace organize community support. The fellowship hall buzzed with activity as church ladies assembled casseroles and fresh-baked bread. The kids moved between tables, distributing paper plates and plastic utensils, their faces brightening whenever someone offered a kind word or gentle squeeze of the shoulder. "Your children are such a blessing," Grace told Daniel when he stopped by to check on them. "They've been wonderful helpers." She gestured to where Jacob was carefully carrying a stack of cups while Lily arranged flowers on the serving table. The next morning brought more testimony. Daniel drove Hawk back to the courthouse, where the questioning continued. More officials were brought in for questioning. Some broke down and confessed, their careers crumbling as decades of secrets spilled out. By mid-afternoon, news broke across local stations. Multiple arrests had been made, including a senior county official. Daniel watched the coverage on his phone during a break, still struggling to process how their family had become caught up in such momentous events. Hawk seemed to grow lighter with each hour, as if setting down a burden he'd carried too long. During a quiet moment, he turned to Daniel. "Thank you," he said simply, "for believing in me, for not running when you could have." Daniel thought of his children, of Grace's kindness, of his father's remorse, of this community that had embraced them. "Sometimes standing your ground is the only right choice," he replied. That evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple, Daniel sat with Lily and Jacob on the farmhouse's wide front porch. The air was thick with humidity, but a gentle breeze stirred the leaves. Fireflies began to blink in the gathering dusk. their tiny lights dancing above the grass. Jacob leaned against the porch railing, tracking the fireflies with his eyes. "Dad?" he asked softly. "Are we really safe now?" Daniel watched a firefly land on the porch screen, its light pulsing gently. "Yes," he said with quiet certainty. "We are." Lily curled up in the old rocking chair, looking more relaxed than she had in weeks. "I like it here," she admitted. "The people, they're good people." Daniel nodded, feeling the truth of it deep in his bones. Here, on this porch, with his children beside him and the sun, fireflies rising from the grass like stars, he felt the fear of the past weeks finally begin to fade. They were safe. They were home. The screen door creaked as Caleb stepped out, carrying a tray with glasses of sweet tea. He distributed them quietly, then settled into his own chair. Together, they watched the fireflies rise higher into the deepening twilight, their lights multiplying like countless stars falling up into the summer sky. Morning sunlight streamed through the gaps in the barn's damaged wall, creating golden stripes across the dusty floor. Daniel wiped sweat from his forehead as he held a wooden beam steady while Caleb hammered it into place. The rhythmic sound of work filled the early air, punctuated by the soft clucking of chickens and distant birdsong. Hawk sat in the shade on an overturned milk crate, his shoulders less tense than they'd been in days. He watched father and son work with quiet appreciation, occasionally offering advice about structural support that revealed his own experience with manual labor. "Hand me that level," Caleb said, reaching toward the toolbox. Daniel passed it over, noting how his father's hands, though weathered, moved with precise confidence. They'd been working since sunrise, and already the barn wall was taking shape again. "Remember when I used to help you fix fences every spring?" Daniel asked, adjusting his grip on the beam. Caleb paused, the hammer hovering mid-swing. "You were always good with your hands. Better than me, really." He cleared his throat. "Should have told you that more often." Daniel felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of old tight knots. The whole town showed up yesterday to help clear the debris. Grace brought 3 casseroles. "Small towns," Caleb said, resuming his hammering. "They can surprise you. They really can." Daniel glanced at the farmhouse where he could see Lily and Jacob through the garden. They were kneeling in the soil near the porch, carefully placing flowers into freshly dug holes. The sight made his heart swell. Caleb followed his gaze. "Your kids are something special, Daniel. Strong, like their father." He set down the hammer and turned to face his son fully. "I've been thinking about a lot of things these past few days." Daniel noticed the tremor in his father's voice. "Dad? All those years I spent wrapped up in fear, in shame about what happened with Hawk." Caleb's eyes grew distant. "I pushed everyone away, pushed you away. Thought I was protecting the family, but I was just hiding. Hawk shifted on his crate, giving them privacy by pretending to study the barn's rafters. I understand now," Daniel said softly. "Fear makes us do things we regret. When you showed up here with those kids," Caleb's voice cracked, "I saw myself in you, trying to protect them, running from danger. But you did it better. You kept them close, kept them feeling loved." Daniel set down his end of the beam. "Dad." "I'm sorry, son." Caleb's shoulders slumped. "I'm sorry for all the silent years, for all the times I should have called, should have visited, should have been there when Sarah passed." Without hesitation, Daniel stepped forward and wrapped his arms around his father. Caleb stiffened for a moment, then melted into the embrace, his work-rough hands gripping Daniel's shoulders. "I forgive you," Daniel whispered, feeling decades of hurt begin to heal. They held the embrace until Hawk quietly cleared his throat. "That beam isn't going to mount itself," he said with gentle humor, his eyes suspiciously bright. Both men laughed, wiping their eyes as they returned to work. The morning grew warmer, but the air felt lighter somehow, cleaner. Near the porch, Lily and Jacob worked steadily in their garden patch. They'd chosen bright marigolds and sturdy black-eyed Susans, flowers that could withstand the Kentucky heat. Jacob dug the holes while Lily carefully placed each plant, patting the soil around them with gentle hands. "These will look nice when they bloom," Lily said, sitting back on her heels to survey their work. Her voice carried the first hints of genuine contentment Daniel had heard in weeks. "Maybe we can plant more next spring," Jacob suggested, and the simple future planning in his words made Daniel's heart skip a beat. His children were putting down roots, literally and figuratively. The morning passed in productive peace. By early afternoon, the barn wall was nearly complete, and a row of cheerful flowers lined the porch steps. The air smelled of fresh-cut wood and turned earth. As evening approached, Grace appeared with another casserole, this time a bubbling chicken and dumpling dish that filled the kitchen with savory aromas. Daniel set the table while Lily helped their neighbor arrange food and serving bowls. They gathered around Caleb's old oak table, Daniel, his children, his father, Hawk, and Grace. Steam rose from the bowls, and the setting sun painted the kitchen walls gold through the windows. "Would anyone mind if I say grace?" Grace asked, her kind eyes twinkling at her own name-related humor. They joined hands around the table. Daniel felt Lily's slender fingers in his right hand, Caleb's callous palm in his left. The simple prayer washed over them, full of gratitude for safety, community, and healing. As they began to eat, stories flowed as naturally as the sweet tea being poured. Caleb shared memories of Daniel as a determined toddler who once spent an entire afternoon trying to catch crickets. Lily surprised everyone by asking about her grandmother's garden, and Caleb's eyes lit up as he described his late wife's prize roses. Jacob, between enthusiastic bites of dumpling, told them about the irrigation system he was designing for their new flower bed. Hawk contributed tales from his own childhood garden, where his mother grew the hottest peppers in 3 counties. The conversation weaved between past and present, pain and joy, loss and hope. Laughter echoed off the walls that had known too much silence. Even Grace, who had initially planned to leave after delivering the food, stayed, drawn into the warm circle of family and friendship. Looking around the table, Daniel saw what he'd been searching for since Sarah's death. Not just safety, but belonging. Here, in this old farmhouse with its creaky floors and history-soaked walls, his family had found more than refuge. They'd found their way home. The week unfolded like pages in a well-worn book, each day revealing new possibilities in Cedar Hollow. Daniel started early Monday morning, walking the 3 blocks from Caleb's farmhouse to the town's modest Main Street. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves, and morning dew still sparkled on the grass verges that lined the sidewalks. Shop owners greeted him with genuine smiles, not the hurried nods of city strangers, but real warmth that reached their eyes. Several stopped to chat about available rental properties and job opportunities, their voices carrying the unhurried cadence of people who had time for neighbors. At Cedar Hollow Hardware, the owner, Pete Mason, mentioned needing experienced help. The store smelled of sawdust and motor oil, familiar scents that reminded Daniel of better days when he'd had time for weekend projects. "Someone who knows their way around tools," Pete said, gesturing to the well-organized shelves lined with everything from penny nails to power drills. "And from what I hear about that barn repair, you certainly do." The older man's weathered hands spoke of decades spent fixing things that mattered, and his straightforward manner put Daniel immediately at ease. Daniel found himself nodding, already imagining a steady paycheck that could support his family in this smaller, more affordable town. The cost of living here was nearly half what they paid in Ohio, and for the first time in months, the constant knot of financial worry in his stomach began to loosen. He could picture himself here among the paint cans and garden tools, helping neighbors with their projects, being part of something steady and worthwhile. Tuesday brought a visit to Cedar Hollow High School with Lily and Jacob. The building itself was older but lovingly maintained, with polished floors and walls lined with student artwork and academic achievements. The hallways were clean and bright, the classes small enough for personal attention, a far cry from the overcrowded urban school where Lily had struggled to find her place. Their tour guide, Mrs. Patterson, spoke warmly about the school's tight-knit community, her genuine enthusiasm evident as she showed them through classrooms where teachers actually knew every student's name. "We've got excellent art programs," she told Lily, whose eyes lit up at the mention of photography classes and a darkroom that students could actually use. "And our robotics club just won the state championship," she added, making Jacob straighten with interest, his face brightening for the first time since they'd arrived in Kentucky. Daniel watched his children's faces transform, seeing hope replace the guarded resignation they'd carried for so long. Wednesday afternoon found Daniel at the local diner, sharing coffee with Grace Holloway in a red vinyl booth that had probably seen decades of important conversations. The coffee was strong and honest, served in thick ceramic mugs, and the apple pie Grace insisted on ordering filled the air with cinnamon sweetness. She'd become an invaluable friend, helping him understand the town's rhythms and resources with the patience of someone who genuinely wanted to see his family succeed. "The kids are different here," Grace observed, stirring sugar into her cup with a well-worn spoon. "I've watched them in youth group these past few days. They're starting to laugh again. Really laugh. Not the careful kind they've been doing real belly. Laughs that come from feeling safe." Her words carried the weight of someone who'd spent years watching wounded souls learn to trust again. Daniel had noticed too. The tension that had lived in Lily's shoulders for 3 years, the constant vigilance of a teenager forced to grow up too fast, was finally easing. Jacob's nightmares had become less frequent, and yesterday he'd actually asked to go exploring in the woods behind Caleb's house instead of staying glued to his father's side. Thursday, Daniel met with a local realtor who showed him several affordable houses near the town center. Each property told a story of families who'd lived and loved within its walls. One particular property, a modest 2-story with a wraparound porch and mature oak trees shading the front yard, caught his attention immediately. The white paint was fresh, the windows welcomed morning light, and the kitchen looked out over a backyard where children could play safely. The monthly payment would be manageable on a hardware store salary, more than manageable, actually comfortable for the first time in years. That evening, Hawk joined them for dinner at Caleb's, and the old farmhouse filled with the kind of laughter Daniel had feared his children might never experience again. The kids had taken to calling him Uncle Hawk, and he wore the title like a medal of honor, his weathered face softening whenever they said it. He taught Jacob about tracking wildlife in the woods behind the house, showing him how to read the stories written in mud and broken twigs. With infinite patience, he showed Lily how to capture better sunset photos with her phone camera, helping her understand how light and shadow could tell stories all their own. "This place," Hawk said quietly to Daniel as they watched the kids help Caleb with dishes through the kitchen window, their voices mingling in easy conversation. "It's good medicine for all of us. Sometimes the best healing happens when you're not even trying." His words carried the weight of a man who'd spent years running from peace and finally learned to recognize it. Friday morning, Daniel sat in Grace's office at the church, surrounded by bookshelves lined with volumes on counseling and comfort. Natural light streamed through tall windows, and the space felt more like a living room than an office, warm, welcoming, safe. "The kids have been through so much," he admitted, his voice carrying 3 years of accumulated worry. "I want to make sure they have support, people to talk to besides just me." Grace nodded with deep understanding, her eyes reflecting years of shepherding wounded hearts back to wholeness. "We have excellent family counselors here, people who understand trauma and know how to help children process grief. And the youth group meets twice weekly, Wednesday evenings and Sunday afternoons. Structure helps with healing, but so does knowing you belong somewhere." By Saturday, Daniel had made his decision. The choice felt as natural as breathing, as right as anything had felt since Sarah's death. He gathered Lily and Jacob in Caleb's living room, sunlight streaming through the window behind them, casting everything in golden warmth. The old grandfather clock ticked steadily in the corner, marking moments that felt full of possibility instead of dread. "How would you feel about staying here?" he asked, watching their faces carefully, trying to read the emotions that flickered across their young features. "Making Cedar Hollow our home, really home? Not just a place we're visiting?" Lily's smile bloomed slowly, like a flower opening to morning light. For a moment, she looked exactly like her mother had on their wedding day, radiant, hopeful, full of trust in the future. "Really? We can stay? We don't have to go back to that apartment?" Jacob bounced on the couch cushion, his energy barely contained. "Can I join the robotics club? Mrs. Patterson said they meet year-round, and they're working on a robot that can climb stairs." "Yes to both," Daniel said, feeling warmth spread through his chest, at their reactions pure joy, instead of the careful hope he'd grown used to seeing. "I found a house we can afford, and Mr. Mason offered me a job at the hardware store. Good hours, fair pay, and he says there's room to grow if I want to learn the business side." "Will we still see Grandpa and Uncle Hawk?" Jacob asked, and Daniel heard the slight worry in his son's voice, the fear of losing people who'd become important. Every week, Daniel promised firmly, "We'll only be 10 minutes away. Sunday dinners, helping with projects, all of it. This isn't about leaving family behind. It's about building something bigger." Lily hugged herself, looking more peaceful than she had in years. "I like it here, Dad. People actually care about each other. It's not like before, where everyone was too busy or too scared to really connect." Mrs. Patterson already asked if I wanted to help with the school newsletter, and Grace said I could help with the church photography. That evening, Daniel began unloading their hastily packed belongings from the truck. each box and piece of furniture representing a chapter of their lives that was finally ready to continue. Lily and Jacob carried boxes to their chosen rooms in the farmhouse temporary spaces until they could move into their new home, but already feeling more permanent than anywhere they'd lived since Sarah's death. The work felt different, somehow not like the frantic packing they'd done in Ohio, but like the careful placement of foundation stones. Every item seemed to matter, to have found its right place at last. Hawk appeared with an extra set of hands, helping to carry the heavier furniture with the easy strength of someone who'd spent years solving practical problems. His presence had become as natural as breathing, and Daniel found himself grateful beyond words for this man who'd risked everything to give them safety. Caleb supervised from the porch, offering directions about the best way to angle the dresser through the doorway, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd moved countless pieces of furniture through that same door over the decades. Grace stopped by with a casserole that filled the kitchen with the scent of home-cooked comfort and a tin of fresh-baked cookies still warm from her oven. Her arrival felt as natural as family, and Daniel realized that's exactly what she'd become, family chosen rather than born, but no less precious for it. She watched the family working together, a gentle smile on her face that spoke of prayers answered and hope restored. As Daniel placed the last box in the upstairs hallway, he paused at the window, his hands still, for the first time all day. The setting sun painted the Kentucky hills in shades of gold and purple, the colors shifting and deepening with each passing minute. For the first time since losing his wife, he felt something he'd thought was gone forever: hope, as warm and bright as the evening light touching the distant ridge, as solid and dependable as the ground beneath his feet. The sound of Lily's laughter drifted up from downstairs, genuine and unguarded, followed by Jacob's excited voice, showing Hawk something he'd found in one of the boxes, probably the old photo album Sarah had made of their family trips. Caleb's deeper tones rumbled a response, and Grace's gentle chuckle joined the melody of family sounds that filled the old house with new life. Daniel began moving their belongings into the spare rooms, each item finding its temporary place until their new chapter could truly begin. Sarah's books found space on Caleb's shelves, mixing her poetry volumes with his practical manuals. The kids' clothes hung in closets that smelled of cedar and history. Family photos found windowsills and tabletops, bringing color and memory to spaces that had been waiting for exactly this kind of life. The rooms slowly transformed from empty spaces into lived-in sanctuaries, filled with the promise of fresh starts and healing hearts. As darkness settled over Cedar Hollow and lamplight began to glow in windows throughout the valley, Daniel felt something shift inside his chest, not the desperate hope of a drowning man, but the steady certainty of someone who'd finally found solid ground. 2 weeks had transformed Cedar Hollow from a mere refuge into something that felt remarkably like home. The transformation wasn't just in their circumstances, it was deeper, reaching into places in Daniel's heart that had been closed off since Sarah's death. The church grounds buzzed with purposeful activity as volunteers set up folding tables and strung cheerful paper lanterns between the massive oak trees for the community barbecue. Children weaved between the adults, their laughter bright and carefree. The late afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across the emerald grass, and the air carried the mouth-watering scent of slow-cooked pulled pork, sweet corn on the cob, and freshly baked cornbread that made Daniel's stomach rumble with anticipation. Daniel leaned against the rough bark of one of the ancient oak trees, his shoulder finding comfort in its solid strength as he took in the scene before him. The sight still amazed him, his children, truly relaxed for the first time in months. Lily stood with a group of local teenagers near the dessert table, her shoulders no longer hunched in the defensive posture he'd grown accustomed to seeing. Her dark hair caught the late sunlight as she laughed at something one of the girls said, helping arrange homemade pies and cookies on a red and white checkered tablecloth. She'd smiled more in the past 2 weeks than she had in the entire 6 months before their arrival in Cedar Hollow. The transformation in his daughter was nothing short of miraculous. Jacob darted between the tables like a hummingbird, his energy boundless as he set out. Paper plates and plastic utensils, with the focused determination that had always been his way. He paused frequently to joke with other kids his age, boys who had welcomed him into their circle with the easy acceptance that only children could manage. Daniel watched his son's face light up as he shared some story with animated gestures, his hands flying through the air to illustrate whatever adventure he was recounting. Perhaps the most surprising sight of all was Caleb manning the main grill station. His father had volunteered for the duty without being asked, something that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. He stood there now, oversized spatula in his weathered hand, turning burgers and hot dogs with military precision while sharing stories with a small crowd that had gathered around him. His usually stern face had softened into something Daniel barely recognized: genuine contentment. When Caleb threw back his head and laughed at something, one of the men said, "The rich," sound carried across the entire churchyard like music. It was a sound Daniel hadn't heard since he was a small boy, and it made his throat tight with emotion that threatened to spill over. Grace Holloway moved through the gathering like a gentle summer breeze, her presence bringing calm and joy wherever she went. She carried a stack of colorful napkins in her arms, pausing to touch an elbow here, offer a kind word there, checking that elderly Mrs. Patterson had found a comfortable chair, making sure the teenage volunteers had cold drinks to keep them going. Her gift for making everyone feel seen and valued was extraordinary to witness. When she caught Daniel's eye across the bustling yard, she gave him one of her warm, knowing nods that seemed to say, "See, this is where you belong. This is what family looks like." Near the punch bowl, which was surrounded by mason jars filled with fresh wildflowers, Hawk stood tall and strong. He was a far cry from the collapsed, desperate runner Daniel had found bleeding by the creek bed. The past 2 weeks of rest, safety, and Grace's generous home cooking had worked wonders on his frame. His shoulders had filled out again, and the hollow look had disappeared from his cheeks. His military bearing remained that would probably never leave him, but his eyes were lighter now, unburdened by the crushing weight of secrets he'd carried for far too long. The constant tension that had made his jaw tight and his movements careful had melted away, replaced by something that looked remarkably like peace. "Sure beats lying half dead by a creek bed, wondering if I'd live to see another sunrise," Hawk said with dry humor, appearing at Daniel's side with 2 paper plates loaded high with barbecue, coleslaw, and thick slices of cornbread. He handed one to Daniel with a small smile. Daniel accepted the plate with a grateful chuckle, inhaling the rich aroma that made his mouth water. "Still can't believe that morning. Every time I think about how close we came to missing you entirely." He shook his head in wonder. "Divine intervention," Hawk said seriously, his voice carrying the weight of genuine belief. "Or just plain luck. Either way, I'm grateful every single day. For you finding me, for your family taking me in, for all of this." He gestured broadly at the celebration around them. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as more townspeople arrived in a steady stream. Each newcomer carried covered dishes and warm greetings, hugs and handshakes freely given. The sheriff stopped by briefly, his uniform crisp despite the casual setting. He shook Hawk's hand firmly and shared a quiet word about how the investigation was proceeding smoothly, all the corrupt players being systematically identified and arrested. Justice was finally rolling forward like a steady, unstoppable stream, and the relief in Hawk's posture was visible. "Dad!" Jacob called out, his voice bright with excitement as he ran over, his sneakers kicking up small puffs of dust. "Mr. Mason says I can help at the hardware store on weekends once we're officially settled. He's got all these old radios in the back room that he wants to fix up, and he says I've got good hands for detail work." Daniel felt his heart swell with pride as he ruffled his son's already disheveled hair. "Sounds absolutely perfect for you, buddy. You've always been good with electronics." The boy beamed like sunshine before running back to help arrange the white plastic chairs in conversational clusters. Grace's husband, Pastor Tom, stepped to the center of the gathering, his gentle voice carrying easily across the yard as he called for attention. "Friends, before we begin this wonderful meal, let's take a moment to offer thanks." As everyone bowed their heads in the gathering twilight, Daniel felt the profound shift in his world with startling clarity. Just weeks ago, they'd been isolated in their cramped rental house, struggling to make ends meet on his meager income, disconnected from any real community or sense of belonging. They'd been surviving, not living. Now here they stood, surrounded by people who had opened their hearts and homes without hesitation, without judgment, without asking for anything in return except the chance to help. The blessing finished, and the meal began in earnest. Plates were filled with generous portions, and conversation flowed as freely as sweet tea. The sounds of genuine enjoyment filled the air, forks clinking against plates, children's laughter, adults sharing stories, and catching up on news. Lily sat between 2 girls from her new school, their heads close together as they planned weekend activities with the kind of enthusiasm that only came from true friendship. Daniel watched his daughter's animated expressions and felt tears prick at his eyes. When was the last time he'd seen her this genuinely happy? Caleb joined them at one of the long tables, his plate piled, impressively high with his own barbecue creations. The pride on his face was unmistakable. He'd found his element in feeding people, in being useful and appreciated. "You've done good, son," he said quietly, his eyes following Lily and Jacob as they laughed with their new friends. "Their mother would be so proud of the man you've become, the father you are." Daniel swallowed hard around the sudden tightness in his throat, his fingers automatically moving to touch the simple gold wedding ring he still wore on his left hand. Sarah's presence felt close tonight, as if she were watching over this moment of healing and new beginnings. "Thanks, Dad. That means more than you know." The evening progressed with the easy, natural rhythm of a community that knew how to celebrate its own. Someone produced a well-worn guitar, and soon music mixed with laughter and conversation as voices joined in familiar hymns and folk songs. The paper lanterns began to glow as the sun lowered in the western sky, creating pools of warm, amber light throughout the gathering that made everything look magical and dreamlike. Daniel found himself watching as Jacob approached Hawk, who sat resting contentedly in one of the wooden chairs near the church steps. His son carried a tall glass of ice water, condensation beating on its sides in the warm evening air. He offered it to the man who had risked absolutely everything to protect them, his young face serious with purpose. The simple gesture, a child offering water to a man who had once collapsed from its desperate lack, wasn't lost on anyone who witnessed the quiet exchange. Hawk accepted the glass with both hands, treating it like the precious gift it was. His eyes crinkled with deep emotion as he looked up at Jacob. "Thank you, Jacob," he said, his voice rough with gratitude that went far beyond simple thirst. "You're a good boy. Your dad's raised you right." Daniel moved to stand beside them, feeling the beautiful symmetry of the moment settle into his bones. The evening air was sweet with cooling grass and lingering barbecue smoke, carrying the distant sound of crickets beginning their nightly chorus. Around them, the community continued its gentle celebration, but here, in this quiet pocket of peace, something profound and lasting settled into place. Looking at his son's easy, genuine smile, at Hawk's grateful expression, at the peaceful gathering of good people around them, Daniel felt the last stubborn pieces of worry and fear release their strangling hold on his heart. They weren't running anymore. They weren't hiding or struggling alone. They were home, truly and completely home, surrounded by family both old and new. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Daniel Mercer, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.